Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Vasto of White in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 36, Hueco Mundo, End. Clouds began forming. Dark and ominous, writhing with tendrils of lightning that shot towards the ground in uneven intervals, along with an inflow of rain and wind that the heat in the area did nothing to hamper. It was a phenomenon created by the world. Something outside the natural laws and bordering on the metaphysical. A fire that burned and reduced all to ashes, and a power akin to creation permeating throughout. Overbearing and imposing, the clashing of spiritual energy released a tension that suffocated all who drew near. He took one step forward, the sound of dirt crunching beneath his feet echoed only by the distant thunder. His presence was one that was similar to a storm. A congregation of such dense energy that it was even affecting the realm of the living, cracks forming in the dirt leading to large fissure-like chasms. The thick azure and overwhelming ferocity of it was not lost on Yamamoto, for the very same disposition had appeared once before along with death and ruin. A malefic and baleful aura, the strongest of its kind. Vasto Lord. The highest of great hollows. The expression on Yamamoto's face stiffened, yet regardless of what thoughts were running rampant within Yamamoto's mind, his past self didn't care for it one bit. His attention was focused solely on Coyote. She was pinned to the ground within a crater, pink orbs listless and blurred yet staring at him all the same. Burns were scattered over her body, patches of black and reddish sores surrounding a punctured wound directly through her stomach, unable to be healed due to a lack of reserves. She was barely alive, and yet when she saw him, he couldn't describe the emotion in her eyes. Her fingers dug into the dirt, a faint tremble in her body as she swallowed and attempted to push herself up, ultimately failing before crumbling back down. Her injuries were just too extensive, a far cry from how she had been before. It wasn't fair. He could understand why hollows were hunted, but Coyote had done nothing wrong. She didn't prey on humans, rather, she maintained herself from the bountiful offerings given at temples and shrines, areas filled with spiritual energy. In exchange, she even watched out for the safety of the locals. He had seen her do this on numerous occasions, himself included when they had first met, due to how similar to a human he had appeared. They were actions that no other hollow would have had done, yet she had done so anyway, only to end up in her current state. And at what cost? The mere act of defending herself? A frenzied spiritual pressure began to brew. Wait here, Stark, I'll be back. His past self could still remember the words she had spoken to him then. The earnest determination, willingness, and solemnity in her actions conveyed with a silent disposition. She had asked for nothing more, resigned to simply living within a mountainside cave isolated by others she nonetheless still wished to protect. All for a single reason he couldn't help but empathize with her for. I don't want to be alone anymore. A lonely path, one that he too had walked upon while bearing the pain of losing those who had once stood alongside him. His hands balled into fists, fingers curling into a white-knuckled grip, and by the time he realized it, he was already standing before Coyote. A shockwave of spiritual energy left in his wake, the only signs apparent of his sudden movement as spatial cracks began forming in the air above. He ignored the subsequent widening of Yamamoto's eyes in favor of gently kneeling down on one knee. Stark, Coyote struggled to say while willing her body to move. She could feel his presence above her. He shook his head, pulling her into his embrace and pressing her to his chest to get her to stop her movements. It was okay, everything was okay now. The matters one couldn't handle alone could oftentimes be settled by others. He was there, her family. He would protect her just as she had protected him. In his arms, she stiffened immediately, inexperienced with the warmth she felt around her, yet understanding it for what it was. Something that had always been beyond her reach, a bond with another. Her eyes began to glisten before a muted sob escaped her lips. He didn't say anything in her moment of weakness, simply keeping her close and whispering into her ear. You've done enough, Coyote, it's my turn to protect you. Coyote swallowed at his words while shakily staring up to meet his clear gaze. Suddenly, a sword's light reflected in her eyes, causing them to widen. She wanted to yell in warning, but she didn't have the energy to. However, she need not worry. A hand stretched out, unassuming and lacking any factors of intimidation. It was a strength that didn't need to be sensed to be understood, for his current power was one that couldn't even be felt. The mysteries and laws of the world could no longer contain him, to pressure him into limiting his ability. For his ability imposed on the world itself. The very strength of his soul. Steel is my body. As if by some unfeasible decree, reality bent, flesh made strong, weak made hard. Steel met steel in a resounding clash of metal, fingers wrapping around a sharp edge and grating. Sparks flew endlessly in arcs, yet no matter how much weight Yamamoto put into his sword, it would not cut. It would never cut. Not with the sheer difference in spiritual energy, the composition itself too distinct to even compare. What he was exerting was not simply the might of his spiritual energy alone, but rather that of his inner world breaking the bounds of reality. A power whose jurisdiction belonged only to one. The Soul King. Impossible, Yamamoto's tone was pensive, disbelieving. The Soul King was a being that was the god of the realm of the living and the dead, possessing the means to change the nature of the world by initiative. Only in the space around the vicinity, the Soul King was no longer the absolute sovereign. It was a dimension of swords and steel threatening to explode out in a moment's notice, reflected from a pair of bronze-colored eyes. His gaze slowly shifted away from Coyote and turned towards Yamamoto, the impassiveness of it sending chills down Yamamoto's back as a set of magic circuits thrummed. Converters of magic, they rapidly began absorbing an enormous amount of latent energy present in the atmosphere, funneling it to the very hand clasping over Yamamoto's sword. In wake of his current strength, swords and weapons were no longer necessary. The attack of a hollow would be enough. He flicked his fingers. Begone. With a word, the world shattered before Coyote's eyes, an explosive force completely enveloping Yamamoto and relieving her of her tension. Subsequently, she could last no longer and passed out in his arms. He readjusted his grip on her before placing the hand he had used to repel Yamamoto's attack under her knees and hoisting her up. She had suffered enough, it was time for her to recuperate. He used his shoulder to rest her head on and gradually narrowed his eyes as the smoke cleared. A bottomless chasm stretched on for miles on end, water from a nearby lake spilling into it and creating a vast blue river contrasting the inferno that appeared alongside it. The temperature swelled instantly, a wall of flames striking forward like a viper's bite, melting the gravel and rocks and turning them into an odorous magma as it quickly approached him. It didn't matter. Yamamoto had simply found the wrong opponent. Fire is my blood. He didn't dodge the blaze, he welcomed it, a fragment of his reality marble piercing a hole into the world. Mere moments away from touching him, the flames themselves vanished without warning. Hovering in the air just above the river, Yamamoto stood in tatters, his breathing ragged as an expression of dread and disbelief appeared on his visage. Cracks and splinters soon began forming over the 4 barriers erected in the air before shattering entirely, Yamamoto's formidable spiritual reserves significantly depleted. In response, he stared silently at the man, expression cold as a sword began forming within his mind. However, he paused abruptly in the midst of his tracing, eyes darting up into the sky and off into the distance. He was being watched. More importantly, he could feel that he had earned the attention of the entity at the center of the world's laws and that killing Yamamoto would only earn him its animosity. Glancing at Coyote held protectively in his grasp, he realized that it wasn't worth it to stay much longer just to vent the anger from within him. He couldn't risk Coyote for it. Besides, he already understood that even if he defeated Yamamoto, nothing would change for the Hollows unless he did something drastic. As such, he glanced deeply one last time at Yamamoto before promptly leaving. He would need all the power at his disposal for what he was planning. Yamamoto bristled at his actions, the weight of his duty urging him to give chase, but he stopped mere moments from moving, forcibly restraining his body. He felt something icy and cold originating at his back. A premonition. Should he so much as even move, he felt that his life would end. Hard as it was to believe, years of battle experience had long since developed a deep trust towards his senses and they were warning him heavily. A minute passed, then 2, and then 10. It was only when Yamamoto felt it safe enough that he glanced behind him. And when he did, his complexion paled as for the briefest of moments, he saw the fading outlines of thousands of objects disappearing. His mouth dried. Sheathing his sword, he looked towards the direction the Hollows had left from and all intentions of chasing disappeared. He couldn't allow himself to die at such a precarious time. The academy still needed him as its headmaster, and the Quincy couldn't be left alone. It was a dilemma between honor and duty. Finally, he let out a sigh and left. Whether it was one of relief or weariness, no one but Yamamoto would know. Just that as soon as he returned, he forbade all Shinigami from leaving the academy grounds for a period of time. However, in the place Yamamoto had just left, a man clad in black subsequently appeared, a frown on his face. By the time he returned to the once burning temple that had housed him, the fires had long since been put out by the coming rain. Charred remains of splintered wood and blackened tiles lay sporadically amidst the ruin of the interior, smothering all who couldn't escape to death. He watched this all with a sobriety that constantly ate at him. He could feel the emotions of his past self, could comprehend them even without explanation. He had always been one to put the lives of others before himself, a fool whose only acceptable outcome was saving everyone. In the end, what had it given him? He paused in a moment of silence, but regardless of the answer, he didn't regret it. He released a breath, pulling Coyote closer into his arms and moving amongst the wreckage. Embers shifted into the air with every step, the dying sparks of life extinguished in mere fleeting moments without warning, much like those that had burned to their deaths within the temple. Carbonized remains were all that were left, fingers curled into claws in an attempt to dig their way out of the rubble, yet failing from the unnatural heat that had suffused the area alone. It was why the power of Shinigami in the living world were restricted in the peaceful times of the future. Innocents were killed as a collateral. It would be one of many regrets Yamamoto would have in the future whilst thinking of the past. The smell wafting into his nose was nauseating, but not as disturbing as the familiarity he felt in his actions by just walking through the remains of the temple. He dealt with everything wordlessly, traveling forward until he reached his destination. "You came back," a voice called out softly, weakly as if in a daze. He stared ahead, observing how Lilynette had dragged herself to lean her back on a blackened boulder, her legs sprawled in front of her. There was something missing from her generally optimistic expression, eyes limpid and unfocused as she stared at the ruins, lips trembling. "They're all dead," she whispered while smiling as if it were all a sick joke. "The stupid old man, the other brats, uncles, and aunties. There's no one left who will search for me anymore when I go hiding." She swallowed, the falling rain making it difficult for him to determine whether she was crying or not. Only the forced smile on her face was just abnormally wrong. "I'm sorry," he said. The words left his past self's mouth before he even knew it. If not for the fact that he and Coyote had taken shelter in the temple, then perhaps it wouldn't have had been destroyed, the lives of the people within left unchanged. Hearing him, Lilynette shook her head while whimpering. "It's not your fault," she pursed her lips, a corner of her mouth lifting from a memory. "Like the old man had said, this temple accepts everyone, even if they're different. You, me, Coyote, we were all accepted. That's why it's not your fault." The two lapsed into silence, he unable to utter anything, and she listening to the pitter-patter of the rain. Eventually, his back turned. "Are you leaving?" a voice called out to him. He turned his attention back to Lilynette and had to stifle the guilt he felt when he noticed the despondence of her expression. The rain had made her face pale, and the wind had long since stiffened her body, fingers shifting blue and cheeks stiff. It wasn't that he didn't want to take her with him, but the difference was that he and Coyote were souls and she was still of the living. Taking her along would be a death sentence, which was why he had already alerted the village folks situated away from the temple to come through impersonated divine intervention. He nodded his head in response to Lilynette's question. "Lying would only make things worse. The people from the village below will come. They will help you," he said. Surprisingly, on mention of the townspeople, Lilynette's complexion seemed to pale further. No, she sniffled, her eyelids drooped. "They won't help. They'd probably kill me instead." Saying that, she extended a trembling hand forward, and from within it, a spark of energy came to life, glowing with a dull light green. "They think I bring misfortune with this power. It's how they explained why my parents died." With a flick, she extinguished the energy, pulling her knees to her chest and snivelling. "It was only the stupid old man that said it's a sign of a strong individual given power by the world, and look where that got him. It was the same for the others in the temple, but they're gone too. There's no one left. No one else would ever accept her. His expression grew grim, after a moment, words of conciliation at the tip of his tongue but faltering when he noticed the look she was giving Coyote. "Is she all right?" she asked tentatively. Looking down at Coyote, her body was still riddled with injuries and burns, her natural healing unable to close the wounds without sufficient reserves. "She's injured," he frowned as he spoke, watching as Lilynette struggled to her feet. "You're injured too. You shouldn't be moving." Lilynette staggered, but she stared back at him defiantly, a hand held over a wound that had stabbed her in the stomach that he hadn't noticed before due to the way she was sitting. It was only the burns that he noticed first. "It's all right then," Lilynette wobbled as she walked, on the verge of collapse. "There's still something that I can do." A soft glow began emanating from her palms, a dull light green that was like a beacon in the night. He didn't stop her. He already understood that nothing he could say would be able to get through to her at the moment, rather it may cause her more pain. Therefore, he didn't move. Seeing his actions, Lilynette swallowed audibly, lowering her head. "Thank you," she whispered as her hands fell onto Coyote's side, the energy in her palms transferring to Coyote in motes of green light. He didn't pay much attention to it at first, but when he realized what was going on, he stiffened. "Why you?" he stuttered out. Lilynette shook her head, and he grit his teeth as a result. At first, he had believed what Lilynette was transferring to Coyote was just the spiritual energy she displayed moments earlier, but focusing on the dwindling energy of her body, it was clear that it wasn't that simple. What was being transferred wasn't just spiritual energy, but the potency of life force itself. Already, he could see visible signs of improvement over Coyote's form, but in contrast, this wasn't something that was easy for him to accept. "You'll die," he said in agitation. Looking up at him, he saw the depths of the blankness on Lilynette's features, cold and unfeeling. "I already have alongside the stupid old man and the others," she said wryly. "At least this way, I can give just one more act of kindness." "No," he was quick to say, yet the hands that were moments away from acting froze. "Please." A sob of despair came out. "I don't want to be alone." Lilynette bowed her head low, her lips quivering. No matter how much he willed himself to intervene, he couldn't bring himself to move, watching as the life gradually left Lilynette's body. The action of giving up her life force even made it such that her body was deteriorating at a visible rate until Lynette faded entirely from the world, her life transferred over to heal Coyote as he stood in a daze. "Thank you." One last show of gratitude filtered into the wind, and then it was gone. Everything was gone. For the first time since his past self regained his memories, he felt hollowness in his heart. This new world he was in, he couldn't accept it. Hollows were hunted just for the sin of existing, and the skirmishes of others placed no regard for those who were powerless to resist. It wasn't fair. The Shinigami were said to be on the side of the righteous and the just, but he saw no justice. Only death and persecution that dragged the innocents in. If hollows had no place in either the realms of the living or the dead, then he would create that place where they could all come back to and call home. So that no Shinigami or Quincy could ever have a reason to fight near human settlements again. His grip tightened around Coyote in his arms. A family even if not by blood. His power swelled around him, stretching for hundreds and thousands of miles, a pillar parting the sky. His was a world of steel and flame, an armory of thousands upon thousands of blades. Yet, his inner reality wasn't suitable for hollows to live in, his beliefs and ambitions reflecting his vast armory a hindrance rather than a necessity. It didn't matter, his past self understood what had to be done. A sacrifice made without a single hesitation. He hovered into the air, thunder resounding in the distance. "I am the bone of my sword." Words of power representing a deeper meaning sent out invisible waves of energy throughout every corner of the world. An incantation of self-belief. Fractures appeared in the air, dark and like broken glass in appearance leading to a dimension of rotating monolithic gears in a bronze-colored horizon. "Steel is my body and fire is my blood." His fingers curled into fists, wisps of rampant spiritual aura acting like tendrils that shot out in all directions. He wanted to make a world for all hollows to live in, to put an end to a life of constant hiding and oppression. He roared, long and hard, carrying an unrestrained might that caused all hollows present anywhere to give pause. A rallying call of a greater hollow. A Vasto Lord. Hollows began leaving their seclusion one by one and moving in a certain direction, attracted by the protection of the strong. I have created over 1,000 blades. He could sense them coming in large numbers without even concealing themselves. Elsewhere, the Shinigami and Quincy, who noticed the large number of hollows, didn't dare to intervene without sufficient reinforcements, otherwise death was the only outcome. Unknown to life. The energy around him thrummed, a vibration felt throughout. Nor known to death. He closed his eyes, peering within himself. Hollows would never thrive in his inner world as it was. What he needed was a land of emptiness and high levels of spiritual energy that would last without conflict with the laws of the world. As such, he had to integrate. He would no longer impose his will upon the world, but instead allow the world to alter his instead. It was the birth of a new dimension. Noble phantasms didn't exist in the world he found himself in, but what did were weapons of rough equivalence called Zanpakuto. The numerous weapons stored within his armory altered, giving life to spirits that weren't present before, parts of a soul belonging to legendary heroes manifesting in their weapons. Ireland's Shield of Ulster. The Rose of Olympia. The hero of the Nibelungen line. They all shifted to accommodate the laws of the world. Yet, even still, there was something he had to give up. The path forward slowly reaches its end, the sharpest of swords dulling in the dusk. His hopes and beliefs, that which gave life to his world, founded upon an earnest wish. To create a universe that was truly empty, lacking wants, nor ambition. The bronze horizon began to dim, a pale moon representing the end of an era rising up into a dark sky as the monolithic gears fell one by one. The embers that drifted in the wind became ash, floating to the ground and burying all beneath, the veins of fire deep within the ground crystallizing into dull gray like quartz. Something within him snapped, the ideals holding his past self's regained memories forcibly stored away lest everything fail. I have no regrets. An empty crucible. He staggered, white flecks of extinguished cinders grafting over his body and enlarging the hollow hole in his chest. And so, as I pray, unlimited blade works. Tribal marks reflecting the nature of the world's laws traveled up and down his body as reality distorted, a ginormous crack forming in the air. The first Garganta. The hollows that had quickly gathered didn't need any prompting to understand what was in front of them, the white sand that they could see through the tear between dimensions evident enough. He stood still, watching them filter in, hordes of hollows that would eventually build their own kingdoms and shelters. They entered with self-abandon, only a few taking the time to stare and commit his image to memory. Currently, the cinders grafting over his skin had yet to cover him completely, preserving his original human-like image and what memories his past self stubbornly clung onto. You will be remembered. The hollow who spoke was a skeleton for a hollow, brown rags adorning his form. This king will remember it. He simply nodded in response, his energy gradually leaving him from his exertion as he watched the skeletal hollow disappear through the Garganta. In fact, many of the hollows understood what he had done and their gratitude simply couldn't be described. They didn't speak, but their sentiments were already conveyed. Not only was the human world stagnating for stronger hollows, but it was dangerous too. Eventually, no other's hollow appeared to enter the Garganta, leaving him alone with Coyote in his arms. Slowly, steadily, he placed her through the tier between dimensions. A place where she didn't have to hide under oppression any longer, and a place where hollows were abundant. She shouldn't be lonely anymore. It wasn't that his past self didn't want to stay with her, it was that he couldn't. His past self still needed to stabilize the world created. As Shiro watched the actions of his past self, he couldn't help but sigh in relief. Coyote didn't die. She would be fine. With that in mind, he observed as his past self opened a smaller Garganta and entered, arriving upon a hill now buried by several layers of sand. It was a place that Shiro knew all too well, the vantage point he had always frequented. Now then, his past self sighed while crouching. There's only one thing left to do. Closing his eyes, his past self finally gave up on the things about himself that he was stubbornly holding onto. The ambition of his ideals and the motivation to continue forward, his soul becoming truly empty. The very representation of the world around, barren and destitute, the pale embers covering him completely as he resided within the center of the realm to act as its temporary linchpin. A blank slate. The Vasto of White. It was the last memory Shiro saw of his past self as he felt the will of the Hogyaku dragging him back to the present. Meanwhile, Coyote stirred, her eyes opening whilst pushing herself off of the sand. "Stark!" She called out softly, gaze shifting left then right. No answer, the barrenness of the endless dunes giving her a sinking feeling of panic as her pupils dilated. She was alone once again. It was a world of emptiness, of white ash and buried swords, the same pale moon reflected up in the sky. A forge without its flame. A hollow world. Hueco Mundo. He opened his eyes, staring uncertainly at the Hogyaku in his palm and sorting out the information in his head as a shudder traveled down his body. He had seen the past, what had happened to him and the decision his past self had made. To allow the Hollows a stable world to live in, his past self was in turn unable to maintain the memory of the ideals that had shaped him into the man he was. Otherwise, the emptiness that the Hollows thrived off within the world would crumble, replaced by an energy unsuitable. One that was pure, rather than baleful, more appropriate for Shinigami if anything else. He shuddered to think of what the Shinigami would have had done if Hueco Mundo actually became beneficial to them. They would have had waged war for certain. Then again, the fact that he had recovered his memories now would have little effect on the world. After spending millenniums integrated with the laws of the present universe, the world he had created had become intricately bound with the others, creating 3 worlds in total. Hueco Mundo, the Soul's Society, and the human world. The only difference between the him of before and the him of now was the connection he felt with the world. The buried armory calling to him to reignite that which had gone cold. Little by little, cracks began forming on the pale white hollow bone armor over his body, shattering completely with the return of what he had lost. His red hair stood freely, his toned body bare of any clothes besides a rag tied around his waist, the hollow hole around his chest having shrunk in diameter. His muscles flexed on reflex, hands clasping and releasing as interface-like patterns briefly flashed over his skin. Shiro Emiya. That was who he was, the man with a dream unable to ever be realized, yet striving for it anyway. How or why he ended up in a world different from his own, he was still uncertain of even with the return of his memories. However, he knew that he hadn't been abducted by the wizard marshal as he could clearly remember dying in life, a force of humanity contacting him, and his prompt refusal. Therein lies the mystery, the time frame from when he had closed his eyes in life, and when he had opened them in death. The answer he wanted was there. The reason for his presence in the world and what he was supposed to do. And the only one who could possibly aid him in this answer was the being who watched over the realms, acting as its linchpin. The Soul King. In the end, he would still have to gain himself a meeting, but as a hollow he knew it would be impossible for any kind of formal request to be approved. Therefore, cooperating with Aizen for the time being was probably in his best interest as he had no knowledge at all about where the Soul King resided or how to reach him. With the shattering of the white exoskeleton around him, he had no choice but to realize that Aizen was still standing before him, gazing at him with a critical eye. "Why can't I sense your spiritual energy?" It was the first question out of Aizen's mouth, but he wasn't in the mood to answer. Instead, he returned the Hogyaku to Aizen and hid his agitation, the dread welling up from within him like a festering wound. She was supposed to be here. He had saved her, made sure that she was safe before stabilizing the world. Therefore why? Why couldn't he sense her unique spiritual pressure within the entirety of Hueco Mundo? It was one of a steady ferocity, overbearing and as vast as an ocean. Utterly unmistakable. Coyote, she had to be here somewhere. Due to the connection he had with the world, it was possible for him to get a general feeling of the others within it to a certain degree. The varying levels of power from the individuals within Hueco Mundo were represented by how radiant a light they emitted in his mind's eye, and Coyote, she should have had been a torch with the amount of strength she possessed. And yet, the torch didn't exist, only a multitude of smaller lights. The uniqueness of her aura was one that he was exceedingly familiar with. Abandoning all intentions of discussing anything with Aizen at the moment, all he cared about was the anxiety he was feeling at being unable to sense Coyote's unique spiritual energy. It should have had been impossible for him not to be able to sense it given how large it had been in the past, and yet no matter where in Hueco Mundo he attempted sensing, he couldn't find her. Uncertainty building, he was left with his last resort. A memory from a certain mountainside he wouldn't be able to forget any longer. For it was something that meant the world to Coyote. Why did hollows roar? An action whose meaning had long since been lost to the newest generation of hollows. He roared, a howl stretching out across the barren dunes, amplified through his connection with the world. A distant cry with only a single intention behind it. Where are you? The distinctness and familiarity of it was not lost within the entirety of Hueco Mundo for the ancient hollows, a deep and guttural roar filled with unbridled power. Barragan, within the center of Las Nacas, blankly looked up into the moonlit sky, a flash flickering within his hollowed sockets. The howls continued, growing more and more desolate with each passing moment, waiting for the response of another that never came. Elsewhere, two others felt a jolt from within them that they could hardly fathom, an inexplicable sadness and mourning that instantly rooted them in place. Wordlessly, Starkey shot up from where he was napping while Lilynet, who was once watching Ichigo train with Nell, swallowed audibly. Both stared blankly into the distance, unable to explain the sharp pain that they were feeling within their souls as the word family persistently appeared in their minds. They just couldn't understand it. The depth of what family meant to them. Nor the reason why they felt like crying. Chapter 37, Sword and Soul, Prologue. Lilynet felt numb. A cold and empty sensation taking root from within her that caused her to rein in on herself, her knees pulling up to her chest as her arms wrapped around them. The howls continued. Persistent yet anxious. Familiar yet not. I'll protect you. She swallowed, her lips gradually pursing. Why did it hurt so much? Not in the physical sense, but in the mere thought of words whose meaning should have had nothing to do with her. Starkey. Starkey. The name repeated in her mind, like a dagger gauging out her soul. Where were you? An inaudible sob left her mouth, the action unnoticed by Silent, who was next to her and watching Ichigo. Sand blew across her face. Particles carried up by a still wind lifting up the tresses of her hair to reveal moistened eyes, tears streaking down her cheeks which she hid by bowing her head and pressing her face to her knees. She wanted to laugh at herself, at her unhollow-like behavior, but all she could do was shiver as the howls ceased, the silence piercing deep into her psyche. Her hands balled into fists, a lump forming in her throat that wouldn't go away. The subdued sniffles came almost without warning, her complexion paling as an inexplicable desire to roar welled up from within her like water striking floodgates. Worse, the feeling intensified when she caught sight of the moon in the distance, an ethereal glowing white of cloudless skies and vacant nights. A moon that was forever the same. A lonely mountainside where only he was missing. Her expression stilled, a bottomless sense of loss overwhelming her as she crumbled in on herself, a subconscious attempt at making herself as small as possible. Nothing made sense, the jubilant mood she had been in before long since faded as her gaze left Ichigo, Nell, and Silent and towards the direction where the howls had stopped. Alone. Always alone. The barrenness of the sand around her never felt so empty. She shook her head in denial. No. No. She wasn't alone anymore. There was Shiro, Nell, Silent, the three hags, and everyone else around her that would gesture to her in greeting. So why? Why did it suddenly feel as if it were all wrong? Take it. A soft yet strong voice, caring and patient, echoed in her ears. The kind that raised the hairs at the back of one's neck. I can't do much for you as I am now, but the least I can do is make you this food with all my effort. Hollows don't need food, she mumbled out unintentionally in a choked voice barely above a whisper, her lips mouthing the words as she trembled visibly. There's no need to go out of your way. Even still, we are family, aren't we? Her body stilled, as if sapped of all energy, the wind blowing over her, unable to elicit a single reaction even as she felt someone land beside her. Starkey appeared, solemn and frowning uncharacteristically, gently taking her into his arms and speeding off without another word. She didn't resist, she could understand the kind of thoughts and emotions Starkey was experiencing exactly, because he too was like her. Her arms subconsciously wrapped around him, seeking him out for a comfort that was inexplicable. For Starkey had always been her only support. She did not know where they were going, in fact, Starkey probably did not know either. The only thing that mattered was that they needed time to think. Nothing. Not a single response. At least not the one he was looking for. He stared out into Hueco Mundo's vast expanse and didn't know what to feel. On one hand, he knew that he had saved Coyote, but on the other, it was clear that she wasn't around. Of course, it was possible that she was in the human world, but the odds of such a thing were too low to consider. After all, the presence of a hollow would immediately draw the attention of Shinigami, and with fewer areas unpopulated by humans, the chances of remaining undetected were abysmal. For Coyote and many hollows who had lived and experienced the harsh life of the hunted, there was no way that they would willingly return to such an oppressed lifestyle. Therefore, the fact that she was gone was like an unbearable weight pressing down on his shoulders. More so, because he had made certain that his past self had saved her. His eyes narrowed under the light of the moon, the bronze orbs seemingly peering at the entirety of the world yet incapable of finding the person that mattered. Gradually, his brows furrowed together in helplessness, understanding that there was nothing that he could do anymore. However, he hadn't given up. There must have had been a reason why Coyote had reminded him of Starkey and Lilynet in the past, but no matter how he thought about it, it didn't make sense. Regardless of the similarities, Coyote was one person, not two. Starkey and Lilynet each had their own distinct personalities. Likes and dislikes. Habits and experiences. They were what shaped an individual to become who they were, and Starkey and Lilynet were too different from Coyote. Starkey was perhaps the most akin to her, but other than his general silence, strength, and disposition, he was nothing like her. Quiet yet motivated. Idle, yet not lazy. A strong woman who spent her days holding up the responsibilities she had placed upon herself in payment for the offerings she took from the humans. Starkey's personality in contrast was far too inferior to compare. It wasn't until the man moved into action that everyone's impression of him being useless ever changed. Lilynet, on the other hand, was a bigger puzzle. She wasn't Coyote, but her resemblance to the shrine girl of the past was uncanny. As his past self had been unconscious for most of the time at the temple-side house, he was uncertain of her temperament, but he felt that it was eerily close to how Lilynet would have had acted like. And yet, as much as he wanted to dwell on the topic, he wasn't exactly alone at the moment. "Are you done yet?" A trace of derision flashed across Aizen's face, but it was gone too quickly to ascertain. Shiro didn't comment on what he had seen as in context. Suddenly howling without warning nor reason was grounds enough for Aizen to doubt his mentality. Still, it didn't mean that he wanted to explain himself, and therefore, he merely nodded at Aizen's inquiry, making a mental note to question Lilynet at a later date. The corners of Aizen's lips quirked into a wry smile, not pressing for an answer he knew he wouldn't receive. On the other hand, Shiro didn't bother answering Aizen's previous question about his lack of spiritual energy either. For it wasn't that he didn't have any spiritual energy, but more likely because Aizen couldn't sense it with his current state of being. In fact, it was all around. All one had to do was breathe or channel the spiritual energy that saturated the very air. It was a world of unlimited blades. An armory without life, yet still a part of him. The desolate aspect of his soul imposing on the realms and sustaining every hollow within Hueco Mundo. This was his world. His power realized. None able to match him within its confines. His back straightened as he regarded Aizen quietly, the man in turn doing the same to him, creating a taut atmosphere. It wouldn't be a lie to admit that Aizen had purposely or inadvertently done him a favor, but at the same time, the fact that he couldn't see through Aizen was grounds for caution. Aizen reminded him too much of a fake priest he had known in the human world, Kyrie Kotomine. A man who had sinister ulterior motives behind an approachable and amicable facade. "You can read my thoughts about as well as I can read yours, I presume." Aizen began unperturbed, a tilt to his lips. "Therefore, you should understand that any more precautions we might have towards each other are simply a waste of time with nothing to gain. Thus, is the concept of mutual benefit. Hindering you at this point isn't in my best interest, likewise you hindering me will make it harder to reach the Soul King's palace." His brows creased together at Aizen's words. In regards to the Soul King's palace, Aizen had mentioned it before, but had never actually explained his method. "What exactly is the Soul King's palace?" he inquired, watching the way Aizen seemed to be waiting for the question. Aizen nodded his head before explaining. The Soul King's palace, as the name itself implies, is the dimension which houses the Soul King. Generally speaking, It's impenetrable due to its defenses, 72 barriers between it and the Siriti with further reinforcement from a wall of Sekizeki rock. However, there is a way. Aizen raised a finger. A royal key, simply called an oaken dot. Aizen adjusted his glasses as he continued. As can be assumed, acquiring it in a legitimate manner is impossible, but forging it isn't. The fact of the matter is that I believe you won't condone the means in which I intend to forge this key. Aizen's tone was tentative, almost resigned. For a man like Aizen, unless he was absolutely confident in his odds, then he wouldn't act rashly. The fact that he couldn't feel Shiro's spiritual energy led his mind to a conclusion he didn't want to consider but had to. In which case, he wasn't in a position of equal ground. Smart as he was, he knew he had to be the first to give way in such a situation. And what requirements are necessary? The way Shiro spoke was less opposing, possibly due to the fact that Aizen didn't seem to have any intentions of deceiving him. First, we need a spiritual ground in which to craft the key. Karakura town in the human world can suffice for a location. Aizen began to list slowly, ignoring the twitch that formed on Shiro's brow on the mention of the human town. After all, Karakura town was still fresh in Shiro's mind, rather it was more of a burnt village the last time he had seen it. It was also the place where everything began and ended. Continue, he prompted when he realized that Aizen had stopped prematurely to let him process the information. Well then, with the spiritual ground located, all that's necessary is the strength of one's soul. Aizen paused. Meanwhile, Shiro didn't see anything disagreeable with the requirements until he realized the true meaning of Aizen's following words. 100,000 of them. A memory flashed in his mind. The destruction wrought by a flame that should never have had been brought too close to the earth. Embers floating in the wind, and the pungent odor of carbonized flesh and ash. A little girl staring off into a cloudless moon, alone. His bands balled into fists. What Aizen was implying was to do something no different from what Yamamoto had done in the past, and the destruction he wrought onto the innocent with his presence alone. Worse yet, Aizen would do so intentionally to harvest the necessary amount of souls. No, out of the question, he was quick to deny, glaring with his eyes. Aizen shrugged without a care. Then what do you suppose we do? Without the protection of those souls, any individual thinking to access the Soul King's palace would be reduced to nothing from the friction of passing through the 72 barriers. He said complacently. Shiro remained silent in contemplation, but he realized that he couldn't think of anything. Frustrated, he could only leave the matter aside, but certainly not under Aizen's discretion. Leave the problem to me. I'll think of something, he said sternly. Aizen eyed him critically, but let the matter slide as he had his own considerations to address. Fine, I'll leave the matter to you, but you have to understand that the problem can't be left unsolved for too long. A past colleague of mine, an acquaintance if you will, named Urahara may have had already deduced my ultimate goal. Kisuke Urahara. The name surfaced in his mind, someone Aizen had once mentioned before and the very same person who had injured Brands. Subsequently, the impression he had of Kisuke was far from pleasant, more so when Brands had recently explained that he had tried to reason with Kisuke before the confrontation. Yes, he's exactly the man I warned you of in the past. A vigilant expression made its way onto Aizen's face, his mouth curving downwards. Give that man enough time and he'll probably devise a method to make it impossible to enter the Soul King's palace even with the 2 requirements necessary to create an oaken dot. He fell silent at Aizen's admission, as an invisible weight seemed to have placed itself on his shoulders. Even still, I'll find a way. End of discussion. He remained persistent, watching as Aizen sighed in response. A tense silence followed soon after, but ultimately Aizen did something he had never done before, prompted by the incessant nagging of his very own Zanpakuto spirit. Kyoka Suijutsu pouted in the air, visible not only to Aizen but to Shiro as well, her clear eyes and calm features tilting upwards as she nodded her head. Very well, Aizen conceded, growing slightly entertained at the way Kyoka's calm facade gradually melted, as if happy that her acquaintances were finally getting along. As many questions as Aizen had about Kyoka's materialization, most of them would have to wait until they were in private. Meanwhile, Kyoka herself willingly dissipated after giving both Aizen and Shiro one last look to convey that she didn't want either of them to fight. It was an amusing sight, and one that Aizen would have to ponder on, for Kyoka Suijutsu was created from a portion of his own soul. In turn, she served as a reflection of another aspect of himself. Nevertheless, it wasn't a pressing matter. Clearing his throat, Aizen's disposition shifted into something not quite cordial, but not quite aggravating either. As I'm going to leave the issue regarding the souls to you, there are still many things I have to do in advance, and you hindering me will only serve to hamper our mutual progress, Aizen genuflected jokingly. Shiro raised a brow. You are asking for permission to move about on your own in Hueco Mundo. He summarized without a second thought. Simply said, yes, Aizen freely admitted without a change in expression. There are many things that need to be done in other hollows you perhaps haven't met yet under my command. Say Laporo Grants for example can aid me in varying technological facets, not to mention that there's still the matter of creating what I call espada with the Hogyaku. A similar experience to what you had experienced, but the lack of spiritual energy I can sense from you leaves me a tad disconcerted. Do what you will, Aizen. He crossed his arms together, looking out towards the vast dunes in the distance, specifically at a certain point before shifting his attention back. In that case, you'll have to pardon me for my urgency. Saying that, Aizen promptly left in the direction where he knew Haribel and the other hollows were. Shiro didn't stop him, he too had things that he needed to do. Hueco Mundo was his world, and as such, he didn't need to worry about what Aizen may do because he could sense him, Aizen's spiritual energy distinct from the other hollows due to its purity, which stood in contrast to the baleful aura of hollows. In that regard, however, he became keenly aware of several others within Hueco Mundo's sands. Shinigami. His expression turned frigid. He didn't have any pleasant memories about Shinigami to speak of, and the fact that they had instigated him into action again and again was evidence enough that they would never get along. They had hurt Brands and Lilynet. They had captured Silent without any regard for consequences. Upholders of justice and integrity, Shinigami were simply unable to reflect that role. He had seen better. An ideal king of the White Walls of Camelot, taking upon the burdens of its people and shouldering them without complaint. The presence of the Shinigami he was currently feeling other than Aizen and the others was enough for him to act. Because if there was one lesson he had learned about Shinigami, it was that they were never far from trouble. He took a single step, and he vanished. There was no gust of wind nor burst of spiritual energy. Only the sound of blowing zephyrs. The moment Soifone felt that something was wrong, it was too late to react. The sands around her whipped up into a swirling storm that obscured her vision, tiny grains finding their way through the smallest openings in her garments and rubbing uncomfortably against her skin. A few even landed in her eyes, prompting them to water as she rubbed them incessantly in annoyance. She dropped the device Yoryuki had intrusted to her from Urahara and signaled for the other members of the 2nd Division alongside her to come to a stop and gather. The sandstorm came from nowhere, the ferocity of it giving her an ominous premonition. As the captain of the 2nd Division and the Special Task Force of the Soul Society, she had long since learned to trust her senses. Every pore and fiber of her body was currently warning her that death was coming. It was a power that she and the others couldn't possibly hope to contend with, the ground seemingly coming alive as an illusory world of steel flashed within their eyes. "See, Captain, the sand," one of her subordinates exclaimed. Looking down at her feet, her countenance turned grim before she and the others vacated the area with post-haste. Something about Hueco Mundo had changed, and there was no telling what this observation entailed. The monolithic gear the party had seen before was gradually beginning to turn, having a direct correlation with the sandstorms in the area. Clank after clank, the gear accelerated, flashes of a bronze horizon emerging in the distance, containing a figure whose presence not even she could see through. "Activate the return device, now." Her voice was urgent, pressing. Staring at the approaching figure, she had assumed that the only one who could possibly cause her to sweat visibly with his mere presence was the Vasto of White. Yet, she was wrong. The sound of chattering teeth echoed beside her, but she was too preoccupied to glance away. Staring ahead, the man drawing closer didn't appear anything like the King of Hollows she had seen in the Siridi. The feeling she got from her intuition was different, smothering. Unlike the others who were ignorant about the situation they were facing, she could understand it clearly. If they fought, they would die. If they ran, they would still die. It was a hopelessness she had never once felt. This wasn't the power of an average opponent, but a foe on another plane of existence. The bleakness of the situation caused her countenance to fall further, but she dared not take her gaze away from the approaching enemy. The only chance she and the others had was to vacate the dimension, but evidently, her subordinates had other opinions. But Captain, what about the mission? One of her subordinates hesitated. She swallowed, a bead of sweat dripping down from her chin before she replied in a clipped tone. There won't be a mission if you all delay any longer. Hurry. A shiver traveled down her back, a premonition of an innumerable number of swords pinning her in place causing her to gasp. No. No. She shook her head to rid herself of the vision, her expression ghastly. What kind of hollow was this? She had seen the power of the Vasto of White, but the feeling she was getting now was inexplicable. It was as if she wasn't facing just one soul, but hundreds or perhaps thousands of souls compacted into one. Spirits residing in an immortal landscape. She staggered back, engraving the scene she saw before her in her mind before she suddenly lost sight of the figure in front of her in her moment of distraction. Fuck. Her eyes dilated. Hurry and go. She yelled out, brandishing her sword. What came before her next in a flash of speed was a hand seeking to clasp onto her. She reacted immediately, her sword striking the hand, and yet she paled as a result. A shower of sparks flew outwards, the noise piercing to her ears along with a realization she didn't want to believe. It didn't cut, she stammered out, her surprise unable to be hidden. Different from other Shinigami, she regularly condensed her spiritual energy to a single point on her sword for increased penetration. The types of defenses she couldn't pierce through could be counted on the fingers of one's hands. The fact that mere skin would have to be added to the list deeply unsettled her. For it denoted the strength of her enemy, one that she admittedly had no intelligence on, and was fighting on its home ground. Anxiety pushed her to the one conclusion she had had from the beginning. Retreat. The situation was too unfavorable. She promptly pushed off her blade and flew backwards, letting out a subconscious sigh of relief when she noticed the completion of the return device Urahara had created. Tumbling in the sand, she dove and fell into the open tier in space her subordinates had hastily set up before promptly entering, panting for breath. She was the last to go, but as she left Hueco Mundo, the unease she suddenly felt gripped her like a reaper's scythe, a pair of unblinking eyes watching her leave the entire time. It was like the hollow before her was contemplating whether or not to catch her, but that was impossible without obstructing the world's order. She was already within the tier between dimensions. She should have had been feeling safe, but reality proved her wrong. It was as if she were under the gaze of a judge. An executioner. She couldn't understand it. Since when did such a hollow exist? With all kinds of thoughts flooding her mind, the only one that remained was the relief of escaping that monster's gaze, and the disappointment of failing Yoriyuki's expectations. In exchange though, perhaps she had learned of something even more vital. A new piece of intelligence. Another hollow the Soul Society would have to be weary of. A reminder of an old acquaintance Yamamoto wouldn't take well to recalling. Chapter 38, Sword and Soul, Part 1. She didn't realize how bad her complexion was until she returned to the underground training field beneath Kisuk's shop in the human world. Beads of sweat were dripping down from her brow and down her chin, the quantity of it causing her hair to dampen and stick to her forehead, yet she hardly cared for the discomfort it caused. Instead, she was more focused on catching her breath, hands over her knees to ease her shuddering. Even now when she closed her eyes, she could still see it, the way that Hollow looked at her. Impassive bronze-colored orbs mired in contemplation as if deciding whether she was worth the effort to intervene. It wasn't natural. There was just something within those eyes that contrasted sharply with the nature of Hollow's, as if the enemy that had stood before her was far more than a corrupt spirit. After all, from the Hollow's disposition, battle strength, and image, everything was off. No mask. No malice. It was almost like she wasn't looking at a Hollow, but another spirit entirely. Subconsciously, her hands began to ball into fists, a chill traveling down her back despite the warmth of the artificial light Kisuk had installed within his underground training space. She admonished her behavior almost immediately, for it was unbecoming of the captain in charge of the Soul Society's second division. At the very least, she had never seen her former captain Yoriyuki lose her composure, therefore, she wouldn't as well. She sucked in a breath, composing herself before addressing the current issue. Everywhere around her, the remnants of her squad that had infiltrated Hueco Mundo alongside her were sprawled over the ground. Some were still panting for breath, while others wore grim expressions that mirrored her own. As Kisuk had been the only Shinigami capable of bridging a path into Hueco Mundo, it was only natural that she and the others would return to his shop where they had initially departed. However, she had forgotten what kind of a man Kisuk could be and had been unable to react in her previously petrified state when she and the others returned falling from the air. They had crashed to the ground and ended up with their current disheveled appearances, but perhaps the one who had it worse was the little girl employed in Kisuk's shop. From the first time iPhone had seen her, the girl Yururu Tsumujiya had always given her the impression of a shy and easily frightened rabbit. Yururu had black hair held up in pigtails with long bangs that covered the majority of her forehead. It didn't help iPhone's impression of her much with how unimposing she appeared in a plain white blouse and pink long skirt. When iPhone and the others had fallen to an abrupt landing from the sky, they startled Yururu enough that she had shattered the pot of tea she had been holding in a tray by dropping it on the ground. Yururu immediately became flustered and scurried off, probably to inform Kisuk of iPhone's return. Expectedly, he arrived with Yoriyuki in the next moment. iPhone's stern expression gradually melted in the presence of her mentor, but swiftly hardened loathsomely once again when she noticed the smile Kisuk was directing towards her. She promptly pretended as if the man didn't exist. "You seem pale, iPhone, are you alright?" Yoriyuki's question caused her to remember her previous engagement with the enemy, and she quickly sobered. "I'm fine," she said curtly before lowering her head and falling silent. She knew that she had failed the mission Yoriyuki and Kisuk had given her to set up a monitoring system in Hueco Mundo, but it was hard for her to admit without feeling shame. For years, she had always been striving to follow Yoriyuki's example as a captain and perhaps even step out of Yoriyuki's shadow, yet to fail on a mission Yoriyuki had tasked of her. It was a blow to her pride. However, she knew that it wasn't something that she could hide. "I'm sorry," she said critically, bowing at the waist. "I've failed the task given to me." She waited for her admonishment, yet nothing came. Confused, she glanced up just in time to see Yoriyuki glaring at Kisuk when the man had opened his mouth to deliver a snide remark. It was no secret to Yoriyuki that Kisuk and iPhone didn't exactly get along, and she didn't put it past Kisuk to comment on the situation. Therefore, she stopped Kisuk before he could get any words out to trouble iPhone. "It's fine as long as you're all safe," Yoriyuki said, looking at the state of iPhone and the others. "As much as I'd like to hear the details of what happened, a small break shouldn't delay things for too long." iPhone mulled over Yoriyuki's words and gradually nodded. Her men needed some time to recuperate after overtaxing themselves to supply the spiritual energy necessary to activate Kisuk's return device. As for herself, she needed some time to think. Time that someone didn't want to wait for. "Get out of the way," a hurried voice said irritably, a young girl forcibly pushing past the Shinigami impeding her. Irritable as the voice sounded, however, the desperation within the undertone was unmistakable. Yoriyuki furrowed her brows, her mouth thinning as Karen forcibly shoved her way to stand near iPhone. The Shinigami that had blocked her path were unable to even put up much of a resistance, and Yoriyuki couldn't blame them. Karen was much like her impulsive older brother, a powerhouse. After what happened in the Siriti, Yoriyuki had taken to training Karen in order to give her a better chance of survival against the supernatural in Ichigo's absence. Like her elder sibling, Karen's potential was vast due to the nature of her parentage. What would normally take a soul several years to become a Shinigami, she had done so in weeks with sheer determination. Naturally, the strain on her body was unimaginable. Yoriyuki couldn't count just how many times Karen tore her muscles or passed out due to spiritual exhaustion. Of course, Yoriyuki had advised her to ease up on her training only to obtain a single reply. "He wouldn't have given up on me." Karen's current presence indicated only one fact for Yoriyuki. Ever since Karen had caught wind that iPhone would be taking a team into Hueco Mundo, she had been unable to hide her restlessness. Now that iPhone had returned, Karen's patience had long since run out. "My brother," she said anxiously in front of iPhone. Did you find my brother? So iPhone stared at Karen, and for once didn't know what to say. As Karen was training under Yoryuki, Karen could be considered her junior, and as such, her impression of her was actually in the positive. She pursed her lips, letting out a sigh she didn't know that she had been holding before shaking her head. Sorry, she said bitterly, watching the way Karen's expression stiffened. Let alone carrying out the 13th Division and Shiba clan's request to search for Kai and Shiba, my team, and I couldn't even make it out past the fringes of Hueco Mundo. Karen stood unnaturally still after So iPhone's admission, but So iPhone didn't miss the way Karen was eyeing the device Kisuk had made to breach into the world of hollows. Her brows drew together before she spoke out in warning. Don't even think about it, she said, barring Karen's path with an arm. With your strength, you stand no chance of surviving, more so if you get transported to the place my team and I just escaped from. She fell silent for a moment, making sure that Karen understood her, yet evidently the girl was having none of it. Karen moved to step past her, and when So iPhone attempted to intervene, Karen released her spiritual energy. Much like Ichigo's, hers was an unbridled torrent of power that she hardly attempted to control. It took So iPhone by surprise for a moment with its sheer magnitude, tendrils of spiritual energy striking against the earth and cracking it, fissures forming into crevices. By the time So iPhone fell out of her stupor, it was to see Karen making a mad dash towards the still activated portal in the sky from when So iPhone and the others had used it to return. Fast as Karen was, however, the Flash Goddess was faster. It was with a quick mental apology to Kisuk that Yoryuki pointed a finger at the structure maintaining the portal to Hueco Mundo and fired a burst of Kido to shatter its supports. Despair flickered across Karen's eyes as the entire thing ceased functioning. Her charge quickly ground to a halt as she screamed. "No! No one understood better than her what the disappearance of the portal meant. She trembled, arms crossing to hug around her as the composure she was barely maintaining shattered. Her eyes moistened, and the lump forming in her throat made it so only choked sobs could escape her mouth as she stared hollowly at Yoryuki. Everything was almost too much for her to bear. Her mother was gone. Ichigo was gone. Yuzu stopped smiling and the old goat face blamed himself for everything. At first, nothing had really changed in the Kurosaki household. The old goat face still acted proactively if just a tad subdued, and Yuzu carried on with her days. However, it didn't last after Yuzu slowly realized the absurdity of Ichigo taking a sudden trip in the middle of the academic year. The concerns only continued to grow until Yuzu did something Karen didn't expect. She hid in the closet when Chad and the others came and overheard Ichigo's situation. She confronted Karen on the same night and hadn't been the same ever since, not after hearing from the report Rukia detailed from the Soul Society concerning Ichigo's most likely status in Hueco Mundo. Deceased. It was as if something broke within Yuzu on that night, and Karen no longer felt comfortable staying at home. Every time she returned to her house after training, it was to see Yuzu sitting alone by the dimly lit table, her eyes unfocused while the old goat face started drinking again. Her home wasn't how it used to be, and it pained her in a way that was impossible to describe. Thus, when she learned that Kisuk had made a device to enter Hueco Mundo, she had tried numerous times to use it. Unfortunately, she didn't know how to activate it. The chance she had when So iPhone and the others returned had been her only opportunity, and it splintered right in front of her eyes. Why? She demanded, glaring at Yoryuki. The despair she was feeling had shifted into anger. If it was Ichigo in her place, then he wouldn't have cared about how dangerous it was. She was the same. In the face of her emotional wrath, Yoryuki only shook her head before Karen's vision began to swim and she blacked out. Yoryuki promptly scowled at Kisuk, who supported Karen's body in his hands after knocking the girl unconscious. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Kisuk tipped his hat down and didn't argue. His method was the fastest method and the one least likely to develop a strain in Karen's relationship with Yoryuki. It didn't matter if she would hate him for it, because she wouldn't be the first in the list of people who hated him, one of which was already giving him murderous glower. Had enough of watching. He called out to his surroundings. Expectedly, he got his response. "I swear the first thing I do when I recover is punch you in the face," Ishine said darkly as he stepped out from behind a formation of boulders and appeared in front of Kisuk. So iPhone stared at Ishine for a moment, but couldn't recall where she had seen Ishine from before. Something about him was familiar though, and it was irking her that the answer seemed to be just off the edge of her tongue. Granted, any friend of Kisuk's probably wasn't someone she'd want to keep in her company. She gave one last glance at Ishine and Kisuk before growing disinterested in their squabbling. It was then up to Yoryuki to step in and placate, Ishine only calming down after taking Karen into his arms and cradling his little girl gently. "You know, if you don't like the way I handle her, why don't you just train her yourself?" Kisuk asked, straightening his clothing from where Ishine had grabbed him by the collar. "It's not like you're doing anything by just secretly watching Karen train anyway." Ishine shook his head. "She's had enough to take in, and I don't want to concern her with my matters." Ishine hoisted Karen over his shoulders before growing stern. "Unlike my daughter Kisuk, you and Yoryuki can't stop me from going to Hueco Mundo to save my family when my powers fully return. And the daughter's still at home." Ishine's expression hardened. Kisuk shrugged before veering the topic away. "I wasn't planning on stopping you, but you should know that going in alone won't end well. With what I know of Aizen, Ichigo, and Masaka should be safe for the time being, if only for the man's entertainment. That's why what we have to do now is prepare and wait for an opportunity." Kisuk shifted his attention from Ishine to iPhone. "If you would, Captain, I'd like to hear an explanation of what happened in Hueco Mundo." iPhone glanced irritably at Kisuk, but relented when Yoryuki gestured for to rest in a guest room where she could brief everyone of her experience. By the time iPhone left to report back to the Siridi, only Kisuk Urahara was left alone to ponder. He sat in his shop. Yoryuki had taken up Ishine's request to spar after accommodating Karen, and the two had returned to the basement below. Kisuk didn't mind being alone. In fact, he preferred it as it gave him time to think. His fingers rapped against the mahogany surface of the short-legged kotetsu he was sitting in and allowed his mind to wander. How long did he have? Knowing Aizen and what he'd do if he'd somehow recruited another strong hollow into the fold, it wouldn't be long before Aizen would play his hand. The question was, what would counter that hand? Already, Kisuk had set up a secondary dimension between Hueco Mundo and the human world as a precaution, and even allowed Yamamoto free rein to watch over it. Ishine himself will probably participate due to personal reasons, and the Wizards would definitely not miss out, but was it enough? His gut was warning him, and he didn't like the feeling. Worse, he felt another migraine knocking on his door. He glanced up to see Ishida, Orium, Rukia, Renji, and Chad staring at him from the entrance of his shop. They had already asked numerous times about mounting a rescue operation for Ichigo, but he refused them in consideration of their current strength. However, they were adamant, forcing him to impose a bargain. If they reached a suitable level, then he would send them along with Karen to Hueco Mundo. Karen's requirement was Bankai. For Orium and the others, it was to prove that they could last against Captain-class Shinigami. Of course, he wouldn't be the Captain-class Shinigami to be testing them like they probably assumed. He was too busy after all. Instead, like he'd always done with troublesome matters, he'd leave it to Shinji. Hueco Mundo was different from how it was before. Its inhabitants, the hollows that generally remained in isolated groups, had begun gathering. Feeling all the changes that had occurred within the time span of several weeks, he couldn't help but admit that he had underestimated Aizen and the lure his Hogyaka would bring. Not only did it allow a hollow to experience an immediate increase to their personal capabilities, but it also allowed a hollow to shed their bulky figures. Aizen dubbed them Arankar, hollows that had broken free of their masks to obtain the power of a Shinigami reflected in the Zanpakuto hung by their waists. Almost on a daily basis, the number of these Arankar began to increase exponentially. Perhaps there was something unique in reobtaining the physical characteristics of a human soul, or maybe the change in his own appearance had been too much of a shock to those following under him. He was the Vasto of White, a moniker of sorts attributed to him due to the nature of his pale exterior. No longer. He donned a red mantle, something he insisted that Aizen not attempt to dye white to match the attire Aizen had been distributing. Aizen persisted, explaining the symbolism involved in choosing white compared to the Shinigami's black. Naturally, he didn't care. All that mattered was how those that saw him reacted. Haribel had been the first to see him, attracted to the disturbance he had made weeks prior when dealing with iPhone and the others, he allowing them to leave with Haribel's intervention. Funnily enough, she hadn't recognized him and attempted to apprehend him only to freeze awkwardly when her eyes met his own. He couldn't fault her for her mistake, however, as his spiritual energy felt completely different after his contact with the Hogyaku. He was stronger. Unbelievably so. In fact, Barragan's previous title of God King was perhaps the most suitable to describe him within Hueco Mundo's space. After asserting that he was who he said he was and inquiring of what had happened to him, Haribel oddly looked at herself in her hollow bone armor before her brows furrowed. For once, she had felt that the armor covering her was unsightly rather than useful. She didn't tell him where she had went thereafter, yet Brands had informed him that she had single-mindedly began hunting Eisen down, much to his bewilderment. In any case, similar reactions occurred with many of the hollows in the land of the Vasto of White. Of particular note, however, was Barragan. In the past couple of weeks, Barragan had once again come to challenge him in their near-daily confrontations, only this time, he reacted differently when he saw him. "It was you," Barragan had said deeply in realization, the personal veneration in his tone hidden. Staring at Barragan, the past he had seen surfaced in his mind. He recalled one of the many hollows that had thanked him before migrating to Hueco Mundo, one famously vilified in the human world as the terror of the Andes Mountains. The harbinger of evil. The skeletal god of death sitting upon a throne of bones. That hollow living in seclusion within the Andes Mountain was Barragan Lusenburn. The very same hollow who had made a promise spoken of in a vow. This king will remember it. Back then, before Barragan had entered Hueco Mundo, he had only been able to avoid eradication due to the war the Shinigami were having with the Quincy. If not for Shiro's intervention, then the reputation he had accumulated in the human world would have led the Shinigami right towards him. As such, the way Barragan looked at Shiro after his changed appearance in their last encounter held no trace of arrogance or pride, only something akin to respect. The long feud between the two strongest rulers of Hueco Mundo ended on that day. He sighed just thinking about all of the things that were happening as of late, the most recent news he had heard from Brands verifying that Barragan had become an Arrancar. Unfortunately, that wasn't his main concern. His resolve hardened as he locked in on a particular spiritual energy before hesitating. He was currently traversing the sky, winds blowing across his face and tooling his hair as he abruptly stopped. Already he could feel it, the spiritual energy before him running in an opposite direction from his approach. It was like a game of cat and mouse, and Starkey and Lilynet were avoiding him. Of everyone in Hueco Mundo, it was only they who had yet to see him after the transformation induced by the Hogyaku, and it wasn't because they didn't know of the current state of affairs. Arrancar were emerging everywhere, and Eisen had already informed him of his contact with Starkey and Lilynet, turning them fully into Arrancar using the Hogyaku. Therefore, the fact that they were reacting to his approach and running away from him was undoubtedly intentional. Their actions only served to verify his assumptions of their relation to the Vasto Lord of the past, Coyote Gingerbuck. Even Starkey and Lilynet's names were too coincidental to believe. Yet, should he forcibly meet up with them to demand an answer? Whatever reason they had for avoiding him, it probably wasn't something he should pry into. It was with such a thought that he reluctantly didn't give chase to the fleeing spiritual energy he could feel and decided to leave halfway through. Starkey and Lilynet would come to him when they were ready. It was his duty as a friend to respect that, which is why he had abruptly changed his plans. Starkey and Lilynet's matters left aside, there was only one issue left to consider, the matter regarding the Oaken. To take the lives of 100,000 souls or not? Obviously, it wasn't an option he could consider, yet what else was he supposed to do? He settled in a sparse location above a towering quartz tree and considered his options as particles of sand that had clung to his body in the air fell and sprinkled over the ground. Around him was a view of the entirety of the lands he had so painstakingly protected for years. The area quieted around him in his contemplation, inspiration striking him when he needed it the most. He would not sacrifice any innocent souls, he didn't need to. He had all that he would ever need within him. "We're at your side." Their words were his comfort. The swords within him. They who had never once left him and kept him company on his lonely path in life. His greatest treasure. He steeled himself, moving away from the quartz tree and moving to the location where he knew Eisen had taken accommodations. It was a refurbished cave with the interior walls lined with white stones of spiritual rock. Past the cave's exterior and within the cave, it actually resembled the outlying of a house. Jin Ichimaru was often seen guarding the front with Kaname Tuan, and it was only when Aizen invited the Hollows in that the two wouldn't intervene. At his sudden appearance, both Jin and Tuan tensed, Jin far more so than Tuan. It was only to be expected with the impression Jin had of him in his last meeting. Shinso pleading for him to convince Jin to reconsider his plans, everything for the sake of a woman who didn't even know how much Jin cared about her. Shiro, Tuan greeted stiffly, a bead of sweat traveling down his brow. He nodded in return and couldn't fault Tuan for his nervousness. Other than Aizen, neither Jin or Tuan were his match. Worse, he didn't give Aizen notice of his arrival, and Aizen had explicitly ordered Tuan and Jin to not let anyone uninvited through. Ergo the predicament. Fortunately, Aizen himself diffused the situation, Aizen's voice echoing from within the building. "Come in," Aizen called. Jin and Tuan glanced at each other, before ushering him through the entrance. Inside Aizen's accommodations, the man himself was busy leaning over a counter undergoing tests with the Hogyaku. It wasn't until he was about to announce his presence that Aizen raised a shoulder to indicate that he knew that he was already in the sparsely decorated room. It was more of a laboratory actually, with screens and monitors set up at the sides adjacent to a bed. "I presume the only reason you'd seek me out is that you've come to an answer," Aizen murmured out as he moved away from the Hogyaku and unwrinkled his garments. He opened his mouth, but Aizen gestured to him with a hand. "You don't have to answer. Kyuka's already informed me that you have a solution." Aizen ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "Admittedly, I still don't know how to feel about her finding a second home in your inner world, but the research itself is entertaining." He remained silent as Aizen cut to the point. "With one of the two conditions completed to create the royal key, all that's left is the spiritual ground in Karakura," Aizen smirked. "When will you be ready to head out?" Faced with Aizen's question, it didn't take him long to answer. Everything he urgently needed to settle had already been settled, leaving nothing left for him to finish. Therefore, he was ready. He conveyed the sentiment to Aizen, and it was hard to describe the excitement in the man's expression. The Soul Society had a head commander, but Aizen had not only himself, but a Shiro. With what Kyuka had conveyed to Aizen of Shiro's true capabilities, Aizen was even more confident in his odds. As Aizen busied himself with preparations, Shiro slowly made his way out while releasing a breath. What was the reason he had been brought to a world that was clearly not his own? Only the Soul King could give him his answer, and no one else. If the Shinigami insisted on stopping him and would not listen to reason or peaceful negotiation, then only one option remained: war. And he didn't exactly have the best impression of Shinigami. War was an odd thing, for it always imposed a distinction between sides, with or against, and Ichigo didn't know which one to choose. Zero. A reddish beam of destruction launched forward, the power held within enough to explode and annihilate a protruding plateau into cinders floating in the wind. The heat of the blast itself traveled outwards in a shockwave comparable to a General Vasto Lord's. Near him, Nell nodded in approval. "Perfect," Nell complimented, walking over to his side and placing her lance down when the shockwave of his attack reached them. Her spiritual energy formed into a barrier and blocked the incoming dust and debris. Thereafter, Nell reined in her power and smiled as a teacher would to a student. "You've gotten better, but it doesn't mean you should grow complacent," Nell lectured. He took her words and yet didn't take it to heart. Lately, he noticed that Nell appeared apprehensive of something that she wouldn't divulge to him. At first it was hard for him to notice with her general stoicism, yet it was evident with the news Pesha had informed her of yesterday that something had happened. Her calm expression had become grim for a moment before resolving itself. Subsequently, the harshness of his training increased without warning. If before Nell had only required him to understand the base instincts that his hollow form provided him, now she required him to fully utilize them. "We don't have much time," he would hear her mutter offhandedly while pursing her lips. He had been too exhausted then to consider her words, but now that she seemed satisfied with his progress, now was the best time if any to inquire. "Why's everyone gathering like that?" he asked, his gaze moving to the congregation of individuals forming in the distance. The tone of his voice was still as guttural as ever. Nell's lips thinned, but the determination never left her eyes. Coupled with her noble disposition, she looked nothing like a hollow. No one in the area did any more. Instead, they looked human, calling themselves Arankar. It was a distinction that he still had trouble wrapping his mind across. The hollows he had thought were bloodthirsty monsters turned out to be people that showed compassion, integrity, and companionship that most people didn't even possess. Even Apasai, Mila Rose, and Sung Sun, who had their reservations about him, would still offer pointers when they occasionally dropped by. Nell herself was evident enough. His teacher, and someone he had bonded and developed a sense of friendship with over time. Without any hesitation, she had taken it upon herself to make him stronger, and for what reason? Because we're everyone's enemies. Her answer back then was enough to get him to realize that he had been too judgmental in the past. Humans, Shinigami, Quincy, among all the major factions, Hollows were always the evil to be dealt with, yet were they really? Nell had told him of the real reason why the Hollows invaded the Soul Society. Simply for the sake of saving a single individual, his mother. In contrast, what impression did the Soul Society give him when they sentenced Rukia to death for the action of saving his life and imparting her powers? His mood soured, but he didn't let it show on his face as he waited for Nell to respond to his question. Next to him, his mother arrived, smiling at him for his improvements. It was a shame that she couldn't speak, yet perhaps it was for the best. He wouldn't know how he would react to hearing her voice once again, the same soft tone that used to call out to him, her little Ichigo. They're rallying to his aid, Nell said after a moment. Something we too will be doing for the upcoming battle with the Shinigami. He startled after hearing Nell's answer. Battle? He stared at Nell confused. She simply shook her head, a wistfulness in her gaze. To be truthful, Shiro hadn't actually wanted everyone to follow him, but everyone insisted, Nell said wryly, her mouth curving upwards. Our Lord of Hollows is that kind of person. He's always been, and that's why he's the king. Even Barragan has lowered his pride and acknowledges this. Hearing the fervor of Nell's voice, for once, Ichigo felt like he actually wanted to meet the Shiro Nell had always spoken of in reverence. Yet he needed to clarify. Is that the same reason you fight as well? Nell nodded her head without hesitation, flashing him the number 4 marked on her back. It's also part of my duty as an Espada, she said, recalling Aizen's explanation of the group. The Espada were the strongest Arankar in Hueco Mundo, ranked from 1 to 10. Generally, Nell would have never cared about such a thing, but when Aizen hinted that her rank could reflect how useful she'd be to Shiro, she quickly accepted being in the Espada despite her suspicions that Aizen had tricked her. Well, it didn't matter. All that did was that she had entered a competition with Haribel for a higher ranking position, neither able to tolerate the notion that one was more useful to Shiro than the other. Thoughts reaching to that point, Nell's eyes narrowed as she made her way to where everyone was gathering. She didn't want Haribel to overtake her. Left behind, Ichigo watched as his teacher in Hueco Mundo single-mindedly headed in the direction of the gathering hollows. Slowly, he realized that this was his chance to leave with his mother back to Karakura town after Nell had gone to the extent of teaching him how to open a garganta. The fight with the Shinigami had nothing to do with him anyway, however, he quickly realized the futility of his thoughts. Mother! He involuntarily called out to Silent, who was trailing after Nell and quickly leaving him behind. He was forced to chase after them, sighing in exasperation when he eventually caught up. By the time he became aware of it, he was in the midst of the crowd of gathered Arankar. There were so many of them that there was barely any room to stand freely. Of all the people he could have had ended up next to, however, it was his misfortune that he ended up near Sung Sun and the others. Hey, it's the brat's friend, Apasai said, looking down on him. His mouth shifted into a glower. I have a name, and it's Ichigo, he grunted out. Speaking of which, he hadn't exactly seen Lilynet in a long time. He had initially thought that it was because she had gone out to search for Stark, but it's already been several weeks. Did something happen to her that he wasn't aware of? He filed his concerns away for the moment as his attention drifted to the woman he hadn't met before and had only heard in passing from Nell. It was the Arankar standing beside Sung Sun, Apasai, and Mila Rose. The one with the unruly locks of blonde hair and a sharp gaze resembling a fierce predator. Tyr Haribel of the Espada. She was wearing an odd sort of white uniform that only covered her top and bottom half while leaving her stomach exposed. She glanced once in his direction before her attention shifted to Nell. "You've improved," Haribel commented. "As have you," Nell said before the two fell silent. As much as Ichigo knew his teacher saw Haribel as a rival, he could also see that they shared a unique kind of relationship. They were comrades despite their differences. Seeing that Nell and Haribel seemed to be communicating even without words, he moved his attention elsewhere. After a Pasai had greeted him, she, Sung-sun, and Mila Rose seemed as if they wanted to continue conversing with him, but chose better of it to emulate Haribel's stoic disposition. His mother on the other hand was focused with staring ahead at the group of people approaching, the main target of her attention being the redhead donned with a flowing crimson mantle walking at the center. Shiro, the Vasto of White. Shiro's expression was hard for Ichigo to decipher, anxious yet not, a worry in his gaze that wasn't for himself, but for those that wanted to follow him. Now that Ichigo had seen the King of Hollows in person, it was to his shock that he felt an empathy from one protector to another. It was almost like they were the same kind of person, just that they stood on opposite sides at the beginning only to meet at the end. He really wasn't a bad person. It was just like Nell had said, and like his mother had insisted on. Thoughts running rampant in his mind, it was only when he noticed another man in the group Shiro was in that he suddenly felt as if he was doused by a bucket of cold water. Aizen Saushik. To Aizen's left and right were two other captains, only one of which he had met before in the Sierra, the captain with the silver-colored hair, Jin Ichimaru. Seeing them, it was impossible for him to mask the anger in his gaze, not after recalling Aizen stab Rukia through with his arm. Agitated as he may have been, no one noticed in the subsequent cheers that resounded. "For the king! Glory to the Vasto of White!" The sheer intensity of the shouts around him forced him to recall just where he was, and he promptly quelled his anger. It was a large improvement from how rash he had been before, never considering his situation, but he was different now. He wasn't certain if the change was just because he was currently surrounded by those he had once perceived as his enemies, or because the notion of having to turn his blade against Nell disgusted him. Either way, he feared the expression Nell would show if he suddenly became her enemy despite all the care she had devoted to him. Nell was a hollow, but she wasn't evil. She was kind behind her frosty exterior, much like everyone else he had met in the world of White Dunes. He didn't realize it, but he had fallen into a contemplative daze in his worry about where he should stand in the coming conflict. It was only when Nell placed an arm on his shoulder that he realized that a garganta had been opened where Aizen and the others used to be standing. Shiro, Aizen, Jin, and the other captain had already gone through. A line had formed with the Aaron car stepping into the garganta in groups. Nell beckoned him forward after Haribel, Apasai, Mila Rose, and Sung-sun stepped through the hole between dimensions. The situation as it was, he suddenly found himself having to make a choice of whether to involve himself or not. Would he just stand by while knowing that Nell was putting herself in danger? Could he even do that when he was certain his mother would be keen on following Nell as well? He cursed his luck, already knowing his answer. Sandwiched between Nell and his mother, he stepped through the garganta, a feeling of vertigo hitting him as the world shifted. The dark between dimensions probably wasn't something he'd ever get used to. More so with the sheer emptiness of it all. When next he blinked, he, Nell, and his mother were staring at Karakura town from the sky. However, Ichigo was the first to notice something off. There were no people below. No vendors manning their shops, no students stressing over deadlines, and only an eerie all-encompassing silence. When he exited the garganta and it closed behind him, it was only then that he noticed that they weren't alone. "This is as far as you all go." The head commander of the Soul Society spoke. Beside him the entirety of the captains and Shinigami of the Sierra stood in formations of several hundred squads manned by vice-captains and seated officers. The gravity of the situation was comparable only to the War of the Quincy in the Age of Old. Shinigami vs Hollow. The clashing of two forces. A battle that neither side was willing to lose. Bound by law, held together by duty. The Legion of Black, the Deliverers of Death, and the Guardians of the Afterlife, Keepers of the Balance. Shinigami. The butterfly's sword, resplendent wings of blue and black flapping on the edge of reality. Navigators guiding the wary soul through the immortal gates that separate the dimensions. Symbols of the Shinigami, the Jigokuko. Opposed to them stood the evils of the world, Scorned, hunted, belittled, the times had changed. A roar resounded, forceful and conveying the animosity of the numerous years of oppression. No longer. This wasn't just about Shiro's objectives any longer, but something personal held within the psyche of every ancient hollow. Barragan's eyes already seemed to be spewing flames. Starkey and Lilynet had it worse. When they saw Yamamoto, they felt such hatred that it nearly overwhelmed them. As for Ichigo, he was different. For he was staring at only a single direction and stiffening. His continued exposure to the vile nature of hollow energy had transformed his current appearance to resemble a horned demon. The mask that had once been on his face now stretched to cover the entirety of his head, the pale yellow glow of his eyes, menacing. His only distinguishing characteristics were the tattered remnants of his black shiakusho and the cloth binding zanjutsu to his arm. He stiffened, not because of the pressure caused by the clashing of spiritual energy in the air, but because of the anguish he saw on the faces of those he knew. His little sister, his friends, and acquaintances, they stood a distance in front of him behind the protective lines Yamamoto had formed. Even from where he stood, he could see the way Karen's complexion was paling, the quivering of Orium's lips, and the bitter expressions that surfaced over Chad, Ishida, Rukia, and Renji's faces. He must have looked like a monster to them. Was this what it felt like to be a hollow? Guilt welled up from within, but he didn't know what he was supposed to do anymore. To his left, he felt his mother's warmth, and to his right, he felt Nell's concern for his safety, her spiritual energy wrapping around him like a shield against the energy of the Shinigami seeking to oppress him. In the end, which side was he supposed to stand on? The light in his irises dimmed. Who was he supposed to protect? Chapter 39, Sword and Soul, Part 2. It was no longer possible to tell just how much blood was going to be spilled today. Past grudges, current animosities, it all led to a single conclusion. War. For the Vasto of White. For the Siriti. A cacophony of noises that deafened the entire area came from the lungs of thousands. The air was fraught with tension, Yamamoto's brows creasing as more and more Arrancar appeared before him in vast quantities. They stood uniformly, forming squadrons that rallied behind central figures that Yamamoto would later understand to be called Espada. The left and right flanks were led by two women who stood prominently at the front, Nell on the right, Haribel on the left. At the center stood Barragan and the others. The organization was almost identical to the formations the Shinigami had set up with their captains each leading their individual divisions. Yamamoto was quick to pick up on this arrangement and promptly shifted his gaze to the location identical to his own, the head commander's. An unmistakable shiver traveled down his back. It was in that moment that Yamamoto stilled, countenance growing increasingly grim as astonishment appeared in his eyes. The grip he had over Ryujinjaka tightened so much that the skin of his knuckles whitened. We meet again. A hollow of the past. An enemy even he had not been able to kill. Human in appearance and wearing a strikingly red mantle, it was the same bronze-colored eyes that reflected compassion. The very ones that didn't hesitate to save a fellow hollow despite risking danger. Memories that Yamamoto would rather have had left forgotten surfaced one by one, the inability of his attacks to phase the other party, and the means the other party had utilized against him before. It dealt far more of a blow to his confidence than he was willing to admit. More so with a single fact. The identity of the Vasto of White. It was him, that walking monstrosity of a hollow. Head captain. Anohana spoke up from beside him. He shook his head, maintaining a neutral expression. He was the banner that supported the entirety of the court guard squads, he would not waver for his was the will of the Siriti. Ready your formations. Yamamoto shouted, his voice carrying to the legions of black behind him. Ready your blades, your wit, and your courage. For once in Yamamoto's career as head captain, he did not adopt a passive stance. He simply could not afford to. His hands grasped onto the haori on his shoulders and discarded it in the wind, the symbol of the 1st Division billowing in the air. The will of the 1st Genryu, founder of the court guard squads. The enemy stands before us. Yamamoto's shout was resolute, unwavering despite knowing the strength of his adversaries. A path and foundation that had been forged in violence and blood. Fight for duty. For your honor. And for the balance of the realms. A decisiveness flashed across Yamamoto's eyes. "We are the Shirai. The Shinigami fell oddly silent, the grips on their swords tightening as determination exuded from them in invisible waves. Toshiro had never seen the head captain speak so gravely before, let alone Shunsui and the others. It clearly spoke of the gravity of the situation, but they would not falter. "I have only one order." Yamamoto tapped his cane, the wood surrounding it vanishing into embers to reveal the sword beneath. "Aizen and the former captains are fine, but no one is to engage the Vasto of White. None of you truly understand what that individual is capable of." Yamamoto's words carried with them an unease that was impossible to hide, drawing whispers from the ranks of Shinigami. Anohana took a moment to stare at Yamamoto before leaning in closer and whispering. "Head captain, was it that hollow?" Anohana's brows furrowed in consternation. "The one concerning your decision in the past." Yamamoto didn't answer, his silence was enough. Years prior, in the midst of the war between the Quincy, Yamamoto had decreed a command to all Shinigami active in the human world to no longer hunt down any hollows. Even groups weren't permitted to act without clearance, leading to mass confusion, as killing hollows was a natural doctrine promoted within the academy. Yamamoto himself had never explained the reason, but Anohana had a vague understanding, as she'd been there when Yamamoto had decided to personally deal with the lone Vasto Lord of the past. Mouth curving downwards, Anohana returned to the rear of the formations. She was the captain of the 4th Division, the healing unit. Unless pressed into action, she could not afford to expose herself or her fellow squad members to danger. It was their duty to keep those fighting alive. It was with this consideration that Anohana had wordlessly left the front lines, giving Yamamoto a single deep glance as the man procured an emblem from his garments. Plain in appearance and made of dark oak and carved engravings, Yamamoto peered at the emblem with a weary expression, his eyes focusing on the symbol of the winter daphne etched within the rhombus shape of the emblem. The protectors of the king, each surpassing the power of all 13 divisions together. The grip Yamamoto had over the emblem tightened, but he had no other alternatives. He needed their strength, for the speculation he had made in the past held true in his mind. The only equals who could possibly stand a chance against a hollow with the ability to create an entirely new world could only be them. Beings acknowledged by the Soul King and imbued with his power. The Royal Guard, members of the 0 Division. The emblem shattered in Yamamoto's hands, crushed into pieces within his grip and transmitting a direct message to the kingdom beyond the 72 barriers. An emergency plea, not for the sake of the Shirai, but for the safety of the Soul King's dimension that the Royal Guard would not be able to ignore. Until then, the Shirai would perform its duties and fight till the death. Shiro's brows furrowed, a sense of unease manifesting from within him despite the confidence he had in his strength. Something was wrong, but he had no time to consider anything. Yamamoto was making his move and the man would not listen to reason. Shiro had fought him in the past, and the man of back then was both few in words and obstinate in perspective. All hollows were evil and had to be killed with no common ground to be had. There was no changing Yamamoto's mindset, for it was the common mindset of all Shinigami, and it infuriated Shiro just thinking about it. It was true that hollows were discarnate souls unable to find peace and transformed by their lingering emotions, but they too were souls. They could talk, touch, and feel like any other individual. Coyote's visage appeared in his mind, and the bitterness of it all caused his countenance to shift. All she had wanted was to not be alone, for a simple life free of solitude such that howling together at the moon was perhaps her fondest and cherished memory. Yet because of the Shinigami and Quincy's constant attacks in the human world, Shiro was forced to sacrifice himself, the only family Coyote recognized as her own, for Coyote's own safety. And in the end, what had happened? Shiro didn't even know if she was dead or not. The only clues he had were related to Starkey and Lilynet, and the two were acting too strangely for him to even consider questioning them. Although he didn't show it, guilt had festered within him. What kind of despair did Coyote feel to have finally found companionship only for it be abruptly taken away in her unconsciousness? He couldn't imagine, and the thought of the Shinigami and Quincy forcing his hand in the past left no more feelings of neutrality in his mind. Even without meeting the Soul King and questioning his existence, there were things that he simply could not agree with. His final reservations about the current situation were shed away layer by layer as he considered everything and came to a single conclusion. If the world sought to kill those he cared about for the sole crime of existing, then he would shatter that reality. Shiro stared hard at Yamamoto as the man brandished Ryujinjaka in a practiced motion and unleashed a wave of heat outwards towards his allies. The remnant flame. The strongest of all fire type Zanpakuto. Shiro's eyes narrowed, interface patterns flashing across his skin as his arms spread forward, hands grasping at the air. He didn't vie for power. He didn't vie for ambition. All he wanted was to protect those dear to him, sacrificing even himself to create a world that others may call their own. Righteous, ethical, honorable, he didn't have to be any of those, just like the life of the Saint of France. A woman waving a banner amidst a bloodied battlefield, beckoning for the divine protection of her brethren. To save those who could no longer save themselves. To give courage where there was only despair. The legend of the Saint of the 100 Years' War filtered through his mind. The meaning of a flag whose purpose was to shield others from harm, resonating within him. The symbol of an iris flower, the fleur de lis. Shiro closed his eyes, clasping his hands over the shaft of a spear mounted with a billowing banner. A battle standard made not to display ferocity or valor, but to provide support for the weary soldier. A holy weapon that calls upon the providence of the heavens, the blessings of an angel. Luminosite eternal. The spear-mounted flagpole of Jeanne d'Arc manifested itself once more. Its resplendent flag unleashing a light down from the sky that shielded the burnt of Yamamoto's attack. Fueled by Shiro's reserves of spiritual energy, the radius of effect increased to envelope all those who would fight for his cause. It was a golden sheen that fully enveloped one side with protections while exuding a holy aura that stunned the Shinigami watching. They who donned mantles of black and red representing the gods of death, and the hollows bathed in a holy golden light. The contrast in the present situation was hard for the Shinigami to swallow. They branded hollows as evil, harbingers of misfortune and calamity, and yet it was not the Shinigami clad in divine providence, but the hollows they had always denounced. Ichigo himself, who was within the security of the saint's banner, only felt more conflicted. Ichigo's body tensed in agitation as the sheen of gold around him eased off the pressure of Yamamoto's attack until it was insignificant. It was the same for all the hollows Ichigo saw around him. If hollows were just savage and corrupt spirits, then how could they be blessed with such light? They weren't evil. They weren't. Ichigo couldn't understand where all the animosity was coming from. Looking at the Shinigami's eyes and watching the way they glared at Nell left him inwardly unsettled. Before Shiro had acted to defend against Yamamoto's attack, it was Nell who first pushed Ichigo and Silent to stand behind her without any hesitation. It was Nell who smiled along with Ichigo when he progressed in power, and it was still Nell that was looking out for him despite the severity of the situation. In comparison, the strict discipline Ichigo could see on the Shinigami's faces left little room for compassion. In fact, he didn't have the best impression of them after the matter with Rukia and their strict regard to tradition. If not for Karen and his friends standing in their ranks, there would no longer be a need to hesitate. Presently though, Ichigo didn't know what to do and reality was cruel. He didn't have long to decide. Yamamoto's expression flickered as his attack completely dissipated. As an experienced commander, he took notice of the confusion and disarray steadily spreading throughout the 13 divisions. They were stunned, the light of benevolence before them making them question the integrity of their actions. Yamamoto knew he couldn't allow this to continue. Jokakuinjo. The fortress blaze. An immense wall of flame shot its way forward, enveloping Shiro, Aizen, Jin, and Tuan within. The heat of the flames was such that not even Nell or Haribel could draw near it, forcing all nearby Arrancar to vacate the immediate area. And yet even as the flames encroached Shiro and the other captains within, a battle standard still stood standing erected upon a tall building. Frail yet uplifting. A point of rallying that all Arrancar looked upon even as the protective light gradually left their bodies. Meanwhile, within the wall of flames, Shiro stood quietly before shifting his attention towards Aizen and the others. His lack of movement to avoid Yamamoto's previous attack was in consideration for his compatriots who evidently had no intentions of dodging. "Is this all a joke to you?" Shiro asked harshly. He uncrossed his arms, which he had left in a defensive position to ward away Yamamoto's flame. Clearly though, Yamamoto's attack was more of a binding skill than it was an offensive skill. It irked Shiro all the more as it hadn't been necessary for him to get caught up in it. Of course, we're taking this seriously, Aizen spoke with a smile. We're just taking in the bigger picture. Surely you don't plan for us to strike this early. Shiro's expression remained neutral as Aizen's words filtered into his ears, and it didn't take him long to understand. Shiro had always been an impulsive individual, choosing to act from the moment he deemed that something was unjust, but his years of experience enabled him to comprehend what Aizen meant. Shiro was akin to Yamamoto on the Shinigami's side, and Aizen and the others equivalent to captains. Therefore, revealing their strength too early would prevent them from taking the initiative later. Everything was decided on the basis of revealing one's trump card and who would reveal what last. It was a game of strategy where the superior strategist would not act recklessly and display their hidden cards. Yet if that meant that he would have to remain idle while others fought and died on his behalf, then Shiro couldn't accept it. You may not feel the need to act yet, Aizen, but it's different for me, he said resolutely. You may see the other Arrancar as dispensable, but each and every one of them has placed their trust in me. Shiro turned his attention to the wall of flame surrounding him and stretched out his hands into the fire. Immediately, tongues of flame crawled up his arms, intent on burning him to ashes. Aizen watched the scene without saying a word, inwardly criticizing Shiro for his recklessness yet growing dumbfounded with what he saw next along with Jin and Tuan. The first fire gave warmth to the world. A remnant flame that did not burn for the annihilation of all, but for the heat of new life. Shiro spoke softly, watching the flames dance around him. Neither Aizen, Jin, or Tuan could understand immediately who Shiro was talking to, but that all changed from the moment they noticed a reaction from the fire, almost like an acknowledgement. The flames didn't appear to harm Shiro, rather they moved around him in a calm yet swelling storm. You are Ryujinjaka. A sacred sword of flame not meant to be used for the mundane. Shiro tapped his chest, willing away the natural spiritual energy that protected his body. The sheer heat around him swiftly engulfed him in an infernal scorching wave. No fear was reflected in his eyes. No uncertainty. He was steel in its truest form, unmarred, and untouched. If not for the fact that he was a hollow, he would have been more akin with a Zanpakuto spirit. Can you not feel it for yourself? You are a flame meant to incinerate evil. Shiro pushed away the hollow facets of his soul and laid bare the presence of his inner world of steel and fire, the truest aspect of who he was. I am steel, he said. Strong. Hard. A weapon neither evil nor good, simply meant to be wielded by a sense of purpose. Your fires will not melt me, will not harm me, for you as the will of a sword can already comprehend why. Shiro stared vacantly at the flames surrounding him. I am not evil. Shiro stepped fully into the wall of flames, his arms passing through first before finding leverage and pulling the rest of his body through. Far from what Aizen and the others were expecting, the fire did not burn Shiro as if his words had somehow directly been heard by the spirit of Ryujinjaka. For Aizen, it wasn't too difficult to accept considering what had transpired with Kyoka Suijutsu, but for Jin and Tuan, it was far different. Wait. Aizen called out just before Shiro left. Shiro glanced back from within the wall of flames, an unwavering conviction in his steady bronze-colored eyes. Aizen faltered at such a sight. There was a certain strength held in Shiro's gaze that Aizen couldn't explain because he himself had never experienced it. He had always been both methodical and practical, never letting his emotions cloud his rationality, but for the first time, he felt as if he had to reconsider his stance. There was a power to be found by acting on emotion, something that allowed one to achieve more than they were capable of even with a level mind. As Aizen considered the prospect, he still ultimately defaulted to his own judgments. You are perhaps the greatest trump card we have, and therefore I advise you to reconsider, Aizen explained as earnestly as he could. Revealing you now would only allow the enemy to maintain their hidden cards, leaving us disadvantaged. Shiro shook his head, looking at Aizen with a pity originating from Aizen's lack of empathy and emotion one needed to bond with others. Shiro's gaze made Aizen feel uncomfortable. Like I've said before, Aizen, Nell, Haribel, Starkey, Lilynet, and everyone else, they've all come to fight at my behest. Shiro turned his back on Aizen's warnings. I am their light, their beacon, so long as they choose to fight for my sake, I will not let them fall. Shiro disappeared beyond the raging inferno, leaving Aizen with a troubled expression as Tuan felt inwardly moved. For Tuan had just seen a justice that was perhaps more beautiful than any he had ever known. To save another not for obligation but because of an unwavering sense of untainted duty. It was nothing like the justice that would allow a murderer to walk free. As Shiro traversed through the wall of flame, the individual that was the most startled with the chain of events was Yamamoto himself. Yamamoto could feel the way Ryujin rejected his intentions to attack and instead even attempted to persuade him to reconsider his actions. It was preposterous, on the level of unbelievable, yet no matter what he thought, reality proved him wrong. Within the sight of all present staring up at the sphere of fire forming a dome-like cage in the air, a hand pierced through the flame followed after by an arm and a leg. Yamamoto's expression stiffened before he quickly took action, closing the distance in a flash and lashing out with his sword. In response, a sword clashed against Yamamoto's own in a swift counter. A blade of the darkest black, seemingly sucking in all light. "You had your turn," a voice spoke to Yamamoto from amidst the flame. "Now I'll have mine." A spiritual pressuring descended and clashed against Yamamoto's own in equal measure. The captain-class Shinigami in the distance were stunned into silence. Yamamoto wasn't head captain because he was the oldest captain, but because he was the strongest in his era. In his youth, it had even been speculated by younger scholars that no hollow was Yamamoto's match. In the current instance however, the confidence the Shinigami had after all their training and preparations suddenly faltered, more so when Shiro fully emerged and engaged Yamamoto into a death match in the sky, his voice echoing out below with a grunt. A message that only the Arrancar would understand. "Baragan, I'll leave things to you." A visible tremor passed through Baragan's body, his hands balling into fists. As the previous God King of Hueco Mundo, Baragan had experience in issuing commands to large numbers of hollows. Of all Arrancar present, he alone was perhaps the most qualified to lead. He had once ruled through fear and deployed his armies through human wave tactics, but after meeting Shiro, Baragan had changed. The boredom of his everyday life replaced by a rekindled ambition to be better. A rivalry formed. It was a feeling that Baragan had not felt since his days fighting to survive in the human world, and now that practically all the hollows of Hueco Mundo were under his control, he would not shame himself. Looking around, Baragan confirmed that the current area was not the human world. The ambience was different from what he remembered, and most glaringly, there were no humans living within the streets. That being the case, Baragan's attention soon shifted to the only anomalies in the fake Karakura town worth noting, 4 massive pillars that the Shinigami were heavily guarding. Baragan's eyes narrowed before he gestured with his arm, calling for his personal guards. Joe Vega and the other hollows of Las Noches quickly arrived before Baragan to assemble a throne of bones. Baragan's appearance currently resembled an old man with wrinkled brown skin in a plain white hakama and haori. He didn't possess the same level of intimidation as he did in his original form, but the fact that Shiro had given him command made Shunsui and the other captains apprehensive. "Joe Vega," Baragan called out after he was seated. "Yes, my king." Joe answered, his appearance as an Arrancar resembling a black-haired young man dressed similarly to Baragan. "Take the rest of my personal guard and secure one of those towers," Baragan commanded, the tone of his voice free of any pride or arrogance. Instead it was collected. "If the enemy proves too strong, retreat and await further orders." "You understood, my king," Joe stuttered out in surprise. After all, having been under Baragan's service for an innumerable number of years, Joe had never known Baragan to be lenient towards failure. Regardless, it wasn't Joe's place to question Baragan's decision, and he quickly took a unit of 200 hollows comprising of Baragan's personal guards and moved towards the southernmost tower. Baragan grunted as Joe left. None but Baragan himself was clearer about the change in his personality. He had become humbler, the prejudice he had had towards other hollows for their inability to compete against him quelled by his inability to defeat Shiro. It made Baragan understand the feeling of losing and being spared out of mercy for the first time. It infuriated Baragan, but alternatively, it allowed him to grow stronger. Therefore, if sparing his subordinates from death a few times because of failure could make them grow stronger, then he decided that he could allow for some leniency. He would no longer lead as a tyrant, but as an Arrancar worthy of his rank as an espada. A gust of air blew across Baragan's body, revealing the number 1 beneath his clothes. Haribal, take your flank and siege the westernmost tower. Baragan's voice was booming. Neliel too, the easternmost. Baragan leaned his back into his throne, releasing a massive pillar of red spiritual energy while glaring down at the most heavily guarded tower before him. Thousands of Shinigami spanned the distance necessary to cross with Shunsui and Jushiro comprising the Shinigami's vanguard. Everyone else, Baragan's tone was harsh as he drew forth his sword and pointed it forward. With me. We're going for a slaughter. Baragan's proclamation was echoed by a resounding primal war cry, thousands upon thousands of Arrancar howling into the air as the Shinigami stiffened in their defensive formations. Death. The Arrancars roared charging forward, many being former members of Las Noches and fanatically loyal to Baragan. Haribal led her flank to the west as instructed while Apasai, Mila Rose, and Sung Sun grumbled under their breath about Baragan ordering them around. Seeing Haribal move and the rows of Arrancar charging ahead of him, Baragan decided that it was about time. He floated forward while seated on his chair towards the north. If Shinigami were truly the embodiments of death gods, then it was time for a rude awakening. The God King of Hueco Mundo was coming. The bringer of death and decay, the truest aspect of a god of death. Furthermore, on his person was not just the power of decay but an energy the likes of which none could have possible imagined or prepared for, stored within a blade pulsating with a dull azure light. A crystallized legend granted to Baragan as a gift in the past and a direct complement to his powers. A weapon of a hero of old in which age only made it stronger like the finest of wines. Baragan's final trump card firmly kept hidden within his mantle. A noble phantasm. Ichigo, keep close, it's time to move. Nell called out to Ichigo before striding forward to the east on Baragan's instructions. Silent was already beside Nell, her expression grave while assessing the sheer number of Shinigami impeding their path. Only Ichigo was still hesitating. Had it been anywhere else other than the east, perhaps he may have been more willing, but the easternmost tower was exactly where Karen and his friends were stationed to help defend. He no longer had any time to think. The sounds of war echoed out as Baragan's, Haribal's, and Joe Vega's forces clashed with the defenders of their individual towers. Only Nell was left and she didn't want to be left behind in her compatriots' wakes. She was just as devoted to Shiro's cause as every Arrancar in the area. Let's go, Nell urged hurriedly, several hundred Arrancar following her as she got fed up with Ichigo's hesitation and directly manhandled him. I can run by myself, he pestered as Nell dragged him by the arm. She eventually let go when he proved his words and picked up speed on his own initiative. Nell nodded at him in approval before speeding a short way ahead where she began issuing orders to the Arrancar under her. As Nell, Haribal, Baragan, and Jovejo led their groups, the Shinigami were not idle. All kinds of defensive kidos sprang up across the battlefield with massive barrier-like temple gates creating heavy obstacles to overcome. In that regard, Ichigo could only stare in Baragan's direction in horror. Baragan was a monster in the eyes of Ichigo and the Shinigami in Baragan's path. Where other Arrancar were hindered by the Shinigami's numerous restrictive and offensive kidos, Baragan alone was unaffected. There was a blackish-purple miasma around him that disintegrated everything it touched. Kido, Shinigami, Zanpakuto, they all withered under Baragan's hands like dust on a counter. It was particularly chilling sight to see a man become a skeleton within seconds of exposure, more so hundreds of unranked Shinigami at a time. Ichigo continued to stare in shock before Nell noticed and moved to run beside him, smiling wryly. To many hollows previously living in Hueco Mundo including myself, it was by Baragan's hands that we imagined our deaths would come, Nell said solemnly. He was a tyrant, a hollow with the ability to kill anything living he touches. Even now it's jarring to me that I'm not fighting against him but alongside him. Nell paused as she stared out at Baragan single-handedly drawing the attention of all Captain-class Shinigami in his area, thinning the number of Captain-class Shinigami both she and Haribal had to deal with. Reluctant as I am to admit this, as an ally, I have nothing to complain about him, Nell bit her lips and resolutely put the matter aside. Baragan's doing his task, therefore I will do mine. Saying so, Nell increased her pace once more, drastically shortening the time it would take her to reach the eastern tower, eager to prove her worth. In contrast, Ichigo was far from motivated. His current attitude about the war was perhaps most akin to Starkey and Lilynet. Both Starkey and Lilynet were part of Nell's flank, yet neither of them seemed to care for anything other than staring at Shiro fighting in the sky, their expressions unreadable. It was as if they were transfixed, struggling with something within them. Ichigo glanced once at Nell, who assumed he would quickly follow after her, and then towards Lilynet and Starkey, who didn't even seem to notice him as he passed by. The oddity in the change of Lilynet's behavior concerned him, but more than that, there was a more pressing issue. His idiotic little sister was charging past the Shinigami's defensive lines and lunging straight at Nell without regard for her safety. Damn it, Karen! Ichigo's expression fell. Karen's eyes were bloodshot, her anger so acute that it manifested in her spiritual energy in the form of a roaring pink skull around her butcher knife-like sword. You bitch! Karen yelled, directing all her attention on Nell, who she had previously seen interact with Ichigo. Give me my brother! Even from where Ichigo was standing he could hear the anger in Karen's voice, the desperation within it that struck him deeper than he could imagine. Perhaps more affected than Ichigo was Silent. When Silent had stood by Ichigo and Nell before, both Nell and Ichigo were tall enough to completely shield her from seeing Karen and Karen from seeing her. With the situation as it was now, however, with everyone out in the open, it was impossible for Silent not to see Karen. In response, Silent stood frozen. Ichigo, who was beside Silent, didn't pay attention to Silent's actions in favor of speeding forward in a panic as he saw Nell slash out with her sword. No, Nell, stop! Ichigo placed a hand on Nell's sword arm and diverted the trajectory of her strike. Nell's eyes widened before she shoved Ichigo away and hastily blocked Karen's incoming attack. What the hell are you doing? Nell grimaced as her blade pressed against Karen's own. The standoff produced a shower of sparks as the edge of both Nell and Karen's blades grated against each other. Ichigo didn't know what to say, seeing the confusion in Nell's eyes and the worry in Karen's. In the end, all that came from his mouth were stutters. I was dash. Mom, Karen's voice cut Ichigo off. Both Ichigo and Nell stared at Karen, whose lips slowly began to quiver. In the midst of the sword lock Nell and Karen were in, Karen's eyes didn't stay trained on Nell, rather they misted over as she stared at a certain direction. Nell furrowed her brows and felt that there was something off with the situation, so she promptly disengaged from Karen while pulling Ichigo along with her. A distance of 10 meters was created, yet Karen didn't follow. Instead, her blade began to lower as she stared at Silent, whose hands were anxiously crossed over her chest. There was a tension in the air that was hard to describe. On one hand, Silent felt compelled to step forward and embrace Karen, but there was an insecurity in Karen's gaze that prevented Silent from doing so. It was like a rift existed between them. Silent opened her mouth, but no words came out. All she could do was smile warmly to convey her feelings, and that alone was enough. It was the same smile. It was a smile that Karen could clearly recall in her childhood, and it left her in a daze. One of the errands Nell was in charge of leading took the opportunity to attack. Karen's back was exposed and she made no signs of defending herself. Ichigo flew into a rage, his emotional drive enhanced by his continued use of his hollow abilities moving him by instinct. Before he even understood what he was doing, Zanjutsu was stabbing directly through the Arrancar's body. Said Arrancar was stupefied, not once believing that he would receive an attack from someone who he perceived as an ally. Blood trickled down Zanjutsu's blade and stained the white garments the Arrancar wore in a deep crimson that horrified Ichigo as the ramifications of what he'd done set in. He hastily withdrew Zanjutsu from the Arrancar's body, causing the Arrancar to stagger back. Why, you were Lady Nell's friend, the Arrancar chalked out in disbelief, his sword clattering to the ground as blood sprayed from his mouth in a choked cough. Why? Unable to even respond in time, Ichigo could only watch as the Arrancar fell limp and crashed into the debris of a destroyed building. Silence reigned in the area. Ichigo felt such regret that it was almost unbearable. The Arrancar in particular had even once greeted him respectfully in the lands of the Vasto of White, where all Arrancar viewed each other not as enemies but as fellow brothers and sisters in arms. Ichigo too had been a part of that community. He had even felt the connection each Arrancar had with each other in their shared devotion. As hollows, they had evolved together as single entities, taking nourishment from swords made of spiritual energy. There was never a source of conflict, only the development of unbreakable bonds and camaraderie. The Arrancar in the lands of the Vasto of White trusted each other, fought alongside each other, and took care of each other. Which was why it was so difficult for Ichigo to turn around and stare at the face of the espada who willingly trained him without any ulterior motives. He didn't have the heart to. Not when he knew that she was probably hurting far more than he was at his perceived betrayal. Neliel to Adolschwank, the big sister figure of the lands of the Vasto of White. Chapter 40, Sword and Soul, Part 3. Death and Ruin. Perhaps those two concepts were the only words that could describe what Shiro was feeling while staring down below at the ensuing battle, a clashing of black and white. A war in which neither side was willing to back down. When did it all come to this? Shiro's countenance darkened as he maneuvered in the air. Obstinate, traditional, unbending, head Captain Yamamoto wouldn't tolerate any kind of compromise, let alone accept an offer to negotiate. Then again, perhaps everything was just wishful thinking. Although Aizen called the hollows Arankar now, to Shiro, they were still the same hollows he had protected on a barren hill of sand. As such, how could he not understand them? Shiro didn't voice it, but it wasn't difficult for him to see the hidden animosity the hollows had. Regardless if they were fighting the Shinigami on Shiro's instruction or not, many fought because they wanted to. They fought both for his beliefs and his personal goals. Therefore, he would do the same for them as the embodiment of their past injustices. He as the Lord of Hollows, the King of Hueco Mundo, would rid them of their past grievances. Trace, on. Swords spontaneously formed in the air, sleek and refined, the sharpened edges gleaming with traces of magical energy. With a swing of Shiro's hands, they dropped down over Yamamoto like torrential rain. Yamamoto's expression fell in response to the attack. Already he was dealing with the consequence of Ryujinjaka pestering him to reconsider his actions, and now he had to do so while dodging. Yamamoto clicked his tongue, unwilling to admit that he was being pressured and instead adamantly rebuking his Zanpakuto as he was forced to block. Enough of this. Yamamoto forcibly suppressed Ryujinjaka despite Ryujinjaka's protests. His convictions were correct, his methods absolute. He was not making a mistake, he was sure of it. Yamamoto dismissed Ryujinjaka's final attempt at persuasion and finally found the clarity of silence in his mind. Composing himself, Yamamoto gripped onto the hilt of his sword with both of his hands, making sure to keep Shiro within his line of sight. Shiro was dangerous, and on top of everything else, Yamamoto already knew that he was outmatched. The kind of power Shiro had displayed back then, it was enough for Yamamoto to inwardly despair. However, one observation at least managed to relieve him. "You are significantly weaker," Yamamoto said gruffly, panting for breath. Shiro stilled at Yamamoto's statement, but only momentarily. After all, Yamamoto was only half correct. It was true that Shiro could be perceived as weaker, yet that was only because of a single reason. Hueco Mundo. The world Shiro had created for the Hollows was naturally tied to him. Therefore, there was a certain level of upkeep constantly siphoned from his reserve to maintain Hueco Mundo's stability. Inside Hueco Mundo he was a god, but outside was different. He was fallible. Yet so what? I am the bone of my sword. He was far from incapable. The reality tore around him, ripples forming as magical and spiritual energy converged to create weapons of myth and folklore. The fluctuations of energy originating from the armaments that formed in the air resembled Zanpakuto, yet weren't. They were different. 3 swords. They whose origin were not born of man, but of legend. Embodying the principle of one who did not fight for the sake of one's self, but for the sake of others. A concept known as duty or responsibility. Perhaps valor? Maybe something else? The answer was one that the swords within Shiro's soul already knew. An acknowledgement from one knight to another. The ideal of the King of Knights and what she stood for in her rule. Chivalry and the steel that stood by it. The sword of the sun. The unfading light of the lake. And the sword of promised victory. One to the left hand, the other to the right, and the last strapped loosely at the waist within a resplendent blue sheath. A resonance of sword and soul. Shiro, I am with you, we are with you. It was almost as if Shiro could feel them standing beside him, the spirits of the swords in his soul, a voice he had not heard in centuries speaking softly to his ears. His hands grasped tightly to the swords in his grip, feeling their sentiments. The enemy thinks us weaker, how laughable. Another voice, suave and confident. There is a price to pay for ignorance. Voice after voice spoke out, leading to only a single phrase. We are one. Something changed in the air, invisible ripples expanding outwards and affecting all. Yamamoto's eyes widened. He could feel it. Ryujinjaka, it was trembling in agitation. All around, the other Shinigami in the area felt similar reactions. It was almost as if a Tsukyaku had suddenly manifested, a gathering of thousands of Zanpakuto forming a single entity. No Shinigami could understand what was happening, but Yamamoto didn't have the time to afford contemplation. Shiro was armed with 3 swords, each of which emitted a distinct aura that caused Yamamoto to become apprehensive, and it was only growing more unbearable. Enough. Yamamoto had no choice but to threaten. Yamamoto began releasing his spiritual energy in accordance to the danger he was feeling as the heat in the area increased exponentially. Yamamoto's power would have had no effect on Shiro at any other time, but the current situation was different. Shiro's lips thinned. The spiritual pressure Yamamoto was releasing was visibly affecting the weaker hollows and Shinigami fighting below. Worse, Yamamoto was focusing the output of his spiritual energy over the hollows. Some were already on their knees panting for breath. If Yamamoto continued increasing his energy, then only death would await those fighting below. Do you think you are the only one who can release such spiritual pressure? Shiro asked coldly before beginning to draw on his own. The release of Shiro's spiritual energy served to counter Yamamoto's, creating an effect similar to crashing waves as the two's auras collided. One was of fire, and the other a tranquil gray. Yamamoto didn't respond to Shiro's question. He wasn't a fool, nor did he release his power out of desperation or at a whim. It was a calculated move with only a single implied message. Neither of them could fight at full power given their location. Otherwise, their subordinates would all die from the pressure. To begin with, all Yamamoto needed to do was stall. The current battle wasn't going to be a battle of spiritual energy, but one of skill. Realizing the meaning of Yamamoto's silence, Shiro's expression remained unchanged. Are you underestimating me? He asked. In a battle of skill, Shiro's sheer versatility was unmatched. Assuming Yamamoto grew accustomed to Shiro's fighting style, he could simply switch weapons and tempo in a heartbeat. Yamamoto shook his head gravely as he readied his blade. Although Yamamoto had always been confident in his Zanjutsu and Hakudo, he was still feeling apprehensive. It's precisely because of my weariness of you that I was forced to take this kind of measure, Yamamoto said gruffly. To be truthful, he didn't want to resort to releasing his spiritual pressure over those weaker than him as it endangered his subordinates, but he had no other choice. Before the war even started, Yamamoto had already read numerous reports about the Vasto of White's protectiveness when it comes to those that served him. Using such an underhanded method left Yamamoto in a momentary bout of self-ridicule, but he knew his priorities. Yamamoto put strength into his arms, his veins popping beneath his skin. Knowing Shiro's sheer versatility, Yamamoto was hardly confident. To that end, he'd already resolved himself and contacted a certain Shinigami for aid. Besides, who said I was fighting you alone? Yamamoto questioned. Shiro's eyes flickered as a shadow entered the peripherals of his vision. It was a man not wearing the traditional black garments of the Shinigami, but instead wearing a simple dark coat and a green and white patterned bucket hat. Well, I would say that it's a pleasure to meet you, the man inclined his head in greeting. But that would be a lie, the man smiled. And I don't like liars and those that associate with them. Shiro's expression remained passive, taking note of the way the man arrived. A hole had formed in the dimension of the fake Karakura town around him. Who are you? Shiro asked. The only method Shiro knew of to directly enter a sealed-off dimension was through the power to distort reality, a strength Shiro didn't believe anyone other than him possessed. Therefore, there had to be some other method. Who am I? The man spoke nonchalantly before his expression sharpened into one of seriousness. I'm sure Aizen must have told you by now. The man was fiddling with some kind of device in his hands. I'm Kisukura Hara, the creator of this dimension and the man who's come up with a method to end you. They were worms, all of them. Black vapors were spreading out uncontrollably, wisp-like clouds resembling the cold touch of death. Nothing more than ants to be stepped on beneath the solace of his feet. At least, he had thought so once before. Baragan moved unhindered, the army of Arrancar behind him eliminating all the Shinigami fortunate enough to survive the initial assault. They attacked in unison, displaying a professional prowess Baragan had not once seen before. Or perhaps because he didn't choose to. He had never aligned his views with the perspective of weaklings, but now it felt like he understood. Even ants had their merits. Just because something was weak did not mean that the potential did not exist. It was once the same for him. He, the ruler of Hueco Mundo, made to see that his stagnation at the top of the world did not mean the end of his growth. With defeat came motivation. And with motivation came new strength and viewpoints. Retreat, none of you are needed any longer. Baragan's tone was hard, barring no room for misinterpretation. He stopped in the air, turning back to stare at the army of Arrancar that had faithfully charged with him. It was different, leading in the front. From where he stood, he could see it clearly. A scene far different from the one he had always witnessed sitting upon his throne of bones as his legions marched forward. A picture of what it meant to truly be a king leading from the front. With every step, his soldiers would follow. With every command, his men didn't hesitate to follow through. It was a kind of devotion and loyalty Baragan was experiencing for the first time. What he saw in the eyes of the Arrancar that followed him was not fear or anxiety, but respect, as he had enshrouded them all in his power and had led them to decimate the ranks of the Shinigami. Even now, when Baragan had ordered them to retreat, rather than immediately obey, many were hesitant and had conflicted expressions. They didn't want to fight with Baragan, nor fight for their own personal gain. What they wanted to do was fight for Baragan, the fallen king who maintained his rivalry with the Vasto of White despite countless defeats while fostering the remnants of a beaten army in the ruins of Las Noches in hopes of an eventual uprising. Lord Baragan, we can still dash, the Arrancars made to argue, but Baragan silenced them all. Enough. Baragan flicked his hand. There was a certain pride in Baragan's actions that was hard to hide, more so now that he possessed a face to display expression. If you wish to be of use, live to fight another day. Yes, it was that motto exactly. Day by day, defeat by defeat, always struggling to eventually improve beyond one's own capabilities. What Baragan needed now wasn't fodder ready to die, but elites that would later join him in future battle. Go. Baragan left no room for arguments. He glared, stone-faced, at all those that chose to linger, forcing them all away through sheer force of will. The last to leave were the three Arrancar excluding Joe Vega that had been in Baragan's service the longest. Charlotte Kilauern, Avira Meredder, and Finder Callias. We wish you victory in battle, my king. They all bowed their heads. Even if it was acknowledged that the Vasto of White was the undisputed ruler of Hueco Mundo, Baragan would always be their king. Naturally, Baragan responded. A god would not fall from the ploys of mortals. Now go, lest you three remember the price to pay for insubordination. The three Arrancar nodded their heads before departing, choosing to aid Joe Vega on the attack of the southern tower. Watching them leave, Baragan stood alone in an area of black decay. The purplish haze he was subconsciously releasing acting as feelers that sucked away all vitality. Rocks die. Energy dies. Life dies. Any and all things will age and crumble with time. With a step, I bring death. With a breath I bring ruin. Baragan narrowed his eyes towards the reason why he dispersed his army. They would only get in the way. Now then, I suppose you fools think you can stop me. He spoke. Jushiro Yukatake. Shunsui Kyoraku. Toshiro Hitsugaya. Three captain-class Shinigami were forced to move to intercept Baragan's warpath. They stood directly in front, warning all other lower-class Shinigami nearby to evacuate, yet it wasn't going to be so easy. With a thought, trails of purple smoke flew out spontaneously, putting the lower-class Shinigami at risk. Don't let it touch you. Toshiro yelled out in warning, hurriedly pulling back as the miasma drew closer. It was horrifying to watch the skin of an individual peel off layer by layer until nothing was left even of the bones. Toshiro had had enough of the sight, the scene of entire units of Shinigami aged to ashes, a memory that would haunt Toshiro for centuries. Unfortunately, many of the lower-class Shinigami didn't possess the means to outrun the miasma. Fucking monster. It was the consensus amongst all Shinigami in Baragon's path. Baragon had not participated in the Battle of the Siritii, making it impossible for any countermeasures to have had been made against him. Yamamoto had grouped up the Siritii's Shinigami into large legions to effectively attack all at once and mix in with the Arrancar army, thereby effectively nullifying the Vasto of White's capability to carpet bomb the field with whatever weapons he could form from the air due to the close proximity between enemy and ally. Of course, such a precaution was only in the case that Yamamoto failed to engage the Vasto of White in combat. In which case, grouping was still the Shinigami's best method to support each other. Against Baragon, however, grouping up was a death sentence. Before the Shinigami could even commence an attack, Baragon had already taken the initiative. What an utter waste of time, Baragon sneered. Come at me, all of you. Baragon swung out his arm, revealing a double-sided axe embedded with a red jewel that resembled an eye. It was the weapon that stored the true essence of what made Baragon who he was as the ruler of Las Noches. He was done playing. The amount of attention he'd drawn to himself was already enough to mark him as a high-profile target for the Shinigami. It was his turn to take a page out the Vasto of White's book and fulfill the obligations set upon him. Shiro had placed his trust in Baragon to lead. A rival acknowledging a rival. The tower before him was the target, all Shinigami in his way, nothing more than obstacles to be cut down. Resurrection, the power to release that which was sealed away. The return of an Arrancar's origins. The aspect of what made a hollow. Spiritual energy the likes of which Toshiro and the other captain had never seen before exploded out with Baragon at its center. Malefic, tainted, vile, it was a cruel and merciless red that denoted the strength of a hollow that was once at the pinnacle of all great hollows. A Vasto Lord. Shikai, Bankai, whatever you Shinigami call it. They all pale in comparison to my might. Baragon's voice was rasped, decisive. I will show you the power of a fallen god king. He never did like his human form. For he was a hollow through and through. And he had his pride. Rot, black mist spewed forth from his mouth, his entire body enveloped in a red light. Arroganti. Toshiro and the other captains shielded themselves from the shockwaves of wind, their arms bent in front of their faces. Fortunately for the weaker Shinigami, every single one had heeded Shunsui and Jushiro's orders to retreat. Therefore, the only Shinigami left in the area to face off against Baragon were Toshiro, Jushiro, and Shunsui. When the spiritual energy stabilized, what appeared before Toshiro and the others was a skeleton donned in a regal purple robe. A broken crown was placed over top Baragon's head and the same fur coating he had always worn in Hueco Mundo was out in display. Much better, Baragon muttered in satisfaction, opening and clenching his fists. The purple miasma surrounding Baragon was far denser than before to the point that both Jushiro and Toshiro were hesitant to approach anywhere near. Baragon could care less for Jushiro and Toshiro's caution, he raised a single finger. The action was so nonchalant that it could be taken as blatant disregard for his opponents, but its effects were impossible to ignore. The breath of death, Respira. The black miasma shot out exponentially at a speed that not even so iPhone may have been able to outrun. The area around instantly hollowed, as if a black hole had suddenly formed and absorbed everything, leaving nothing behind. A single touch would rot everything. Fortunately, Toshiro, Jushiro, and Shunsui were prepared due to their caution. From the moment Baragon called out his attack, to the moment Toshiro and the others reacted, they had already retreated to a safe distance. Seeing the devastation Baragon's attack caused, a chill went down Toshiro's back. Had Baragon released such an attack from the beginning when the army of Shinigami were still in close proximity, then it wasn't hard to imagine the results. Toshiro's confidence fell. He didn't say anything, but in the midst of retreating he had performed a test. He had shot out a torrent of Hirin Meru's ice to block Baragon's purple haze to no effect. It was a slap in the face alluding to a harsh reality. There was nothing Toshiro felt that he could do against Baragon. Even with all of his intelligence, there was no answer to be found. Let alone defeat Baragon, it was already impossible to draw close to him. Toshiro gritted his teeth in frustration. It was then that Jushiro spoke out. "Let me give this a try," Jushiro said, making to step into the path of the lingering Respira in the air. Jushiro's Zanpakuto was known as Sogyo no Kotori, a pair of swords that allowed Jushiro to absorb an enemy's energy attack and rebound it back to the enemy. Whatever attack Baragan used, Jushiro was gambling on the fact that the miasma must have been made of an energy he could redirect and utilize. Still, Jushiro couldn't help but feel hesitant. He had seen it firsthand, the way the Zanpakuto of the lower-class Shinigami aged to dust. If his gamble failed, then what would happen to Sogyo no Kotori? It wasn't something Jushiro wanted to think about, nor was it something he would have to dwell on for too long either. Shunsui would make sure of that. I don't think that's a good idea, Jushiro, leave this one to me and go help the others. Shunsui tipped his straw hat down. Rather than fighting here, you and Captain Hitsugaya are needed elsewhere. As Shunsui spoke, he gestured to Haribal leading Sung-sun, Apasai, and Mila Rose on the opposite side of the battlefield towards the pale faces of the lieutenants guarding the western tower. The lieutenants stationed at the west tower won't be able to hold that type of firepower back, he stated. Hinamari, Rangiku. Toshiro said in concern, recalling the placement of his friend and lieutenant. The situation didn't look good. With the sheer chaos Baragan had caused, neither Toshiro or Jushiro had had the time to take their proper positions. So iPhone had already gone to intercept Joe Vega in the southern tower while Sage and Komamura had gone to aid the eastern tower. Kenpaka wasn't even up for consideration in strategic placement as the man simply led the 11th Division on a massacre on the battlefield. Both Toshiro and Jushiro were meant to be elsewhere. They couldn't afford to remain where they were unless they could instantly defeat Baragan. However, the matchup was impossible for both Toshiro and Jushiro, who needed to get in close to do any actual damage. Enough thinking, Shunsui chastised. Get going the both of you, before this hard ass does something to stop you. Alright, Toshiro said. Wings of ice formed on his back before he immediately took off. It wasn't difficult to see just how important he saw Hinamori and Rangiku as. Jushiro didn't leave right away. He stared hard at Shunsui. As the two had been friends for years, Jushiro knew Shunsui's habits and strengths well. Are you certain about this? Jushiro asked. Shunsui smirked. Far more certain than the odds of you losing your swords. You already know the uniqueness of my Zanpakuto. Let me handle this. Jushiro's lips thinned, but he didn't argue either before leaving. Noticing how his three opponents had suddenly dropped down to one, rage began to bubble up within Baragan's chest. Just you alone. Baragan said in ridicule. You overestimate yourself. That may very well be the case, Shunsui freely admitted. But I'll have you know, I can be a sore loser sometimes. Baragan remained silent. There was no need to converse with a fool, but for one reason or another, Baragan sensed something odd from Shunsui. A confidence that should not been present given his circumstances, let alone the words that came from Shunsui's mouth. Well, fallen God King. Shunsui smiled as he approached. How about we play a game? Elsewhere, the tension was running high in the direction of the eastern tower. It was an oppressive kind of silence, the kind where words were hard to come by. Ichigo, being at the center of it all, felt it the worst. His nerves were high-strung and the weight of the stairs over his shoulders was stifling. It was unbearable. Friend. Ally. Companion. That was what he once was to them. But now, in the eyes of the Arrancar, all he received were glares. Ichigo's hands balled into fists in self-ridicule. It was one thing to be wrongfully judged, but it was another thing entirely to prove one's innocence. There was simply nothing he could say in the current situation, as the Arrancar's reactions were justified. In a position where he was trusted by all, the sword in his hands effectively severed all relations. Ichigo swallowed. Ichigo. Karen called out in a daze. Nothing was making sense to her. Her mom's sudden reappearance, Ichigo's apparent lucidity, nothing fell in line with her previous thoughts and assumptions. If the Hollows were as evil as the Shinigami explained them to be, then why did Ichigo appear to be so guilt-stricken over his actions? Better yet, why was it that her mom was looking at her in reproach? Karen pursed her lips, but she knew it wasn't the time to act recklessly. She, Ichigo, and Silent were surrounded entirely by Arrancar, all of which neither Ichigo or Silent seemed inclined to attack. Ichigo didn't respond to Karen's question. Instead, he merely raised his sword up in resignation. There was simply no explanation to give. The glares directed on Ichigo turned murderous in the instant he readied his sword. "Why, you ungrateful traitor! Filth! What did Lady Nell possibly see in you?" Ichigo took all insults with a neutral face, flinching only when Nell was mentioned and turning his head away in shame. The action only infuriated the Arankars further. If Ichigo had at least attempted to defend himself, then there could have been a chance that he had been forced into action. However, by remaining quiet, it was a clear admission. The Arankars bristled, many drawing their swords. As animosity and anger reached their peak, a woman stepped forward. She who stood in front of both Ichigo and Karen, shielding them from danger regardless of what they had done or whose side they were on. Silent, the hollow without a voice. A mother even by instinct. "Silent, why are you defending them?" an Arankar shouted in befuddlement. Silent merely shook her head, her expression unflinching, her body immovable. Staring at Silent's back, it wasn't just Ichigo whose breath shook, but Karen's too. It was a familiar view. One that neither Ichigo or Karen had seen in years, not since they were little and still clinging to their mother's legs for protection. "Mom," Karen muttered out before biting on her lips and readying her sword. If anyone dared attack Silent, then Karen didn't care what would happen to her. She'd murder them all. Noticing Karen's stance, it wasn't difficult for Ichigo to understand the thoughts going through her mind. At any other time, perhaps he would have been the same, but how could he fight knowing that the enemy Karen would risk it all to defeat were individuals he and Silent saw as friends? Ichigo hesitated, but the patience of the Arankar had long since run out. They'd already decided to just subdue Silent and directly attack Ichigo and Karen. Glancing at each other, the Arankar took action in an instant. 4 dashed in to apprehend Silent while the rest moved into to attack. Karen's eyes dilated in fury, but before she could even swing her sword, an authoritative voice froze all. "Wait," Nell spoke softly. "Don't attack." It was the first time Nell had spoken since Ichigo had lashed out. Unlike all the Arankar that were up in arms over Ichigo's betrayal, she alone had taken the time to assess the injuries of the Arankar Ichigo stabbed. Currently, the injured Arankar was unconscious. Blood dyed the white garments the Arankar wore in a deep red, and it was clear that unless medical attention was received, then the wound would prove fatal. It was knowing this fact that Nell's expression was frosty. There had to have been a reason. There had to have been. Nell was still trying to convince herself as she stared right at Ichigo. Why? The question was laced with all the turbulent emotions Nell was suppressing: grief, anger, confusion. If Ichigo didn't know her so well, then he would never have had noticed the subtle changes in her facial features. She wanted to believe in him. In the individual she thought she knew. It was the kind of trust that only a hollow such as Nell seemed to possess. It made it difficult for Ichigo to form any excuses or remain quiet out of guilt. What Nell wanted was the truth, and he would give it to her. Ichigo pulled both Karen and Silent in close, the sudden action catching both off guard. Karen released a small yelp as a result while Silent widened her eyes. Ichigo ignored their reactions. He stared directly at Nell. "They are family," he said strongly. "I couldn't stand aside and watch them get killed." The revelation stunned Nell. It was rare for a hollow to possess any kind of memory about their lives in the world of the living, but it wasn't impossible. She herself could recall vague snippets of her past life, yet perhaps Ichigo was an exception. Family? Hollows didn't have families, but perhaps the closest thing Nell had to one was her relationship between Ichigo, Pesha, Dondokaka, and her colleagues in the lands of the Vasto of White. In which case, she could relate to why Ichigo had attacked so ruthlessly. Hearing Ichigo's reason, Nell's expression softened before her lips thinned. No matter what reason Ichigo gave, Nell understood that it wouldn't change what had already happened. She solemnly stared at the dying Arankar in her hands, feeling for the first time that she didn't know what to do. However, Nell was a decisive woman. "Come here, Ichigo." "Silent," Nell called out, her expression unreadable. Ichigo and Silent glanced at each other, but neither could feel any kind of bloodlust coming from Nell. Tentatively, the two began moving forward, only hesitating when they realized Karen was left standing alone. Ichigo eyed the Aaron car nearby, but despite their unwillingness over the present matter, none made a move against Karen, whose mouth was slowly curving downward. Something didn't feel quite right, yet Karen understood that it wasn't the time to voice her doubts. Arriving next to Nell, Ichigo watched as Nell nodded at him and silent, a wry smile coming over her face before she gestured for an Aaron car to take the injured man off of her hands. Nell sighed thereafter, closing her mouth as her brows furrowed. Suddenly, she wrapped her arms around both Ichigo and Silent in all-encompassing hug. "Even when we're out of training, you really do know how to cause others to worry, don't you?" Nell whispered into Ichigo's ear in complaint. Ichigo felt too ashamed to reply to Nell's statement and simply coughed into a hand. Nell then shifted her attention towards Silent in helplessness. "And you, why are all the problems always related to you?" Silent simply tilted her head. Feeling the two in her arms, Nell was strongly reminded of her friends, Pesha and Dondakaka. She'd always been the one to protect them, and in turn, they had always been the ones to stay by her side. In the easy times and in the hard times. That was what it meant to form bonds. Family, huh? Hollows didn't have families, but the people Nell cared for could be considered her family, she the elder sister who watched out for the sake of the rest. That was why her current choice was difficult to make. "He's going to die, you know." Nell spoke without power, referring to the Aaron car she had passed off to be looked after. It wasn't possible to heal him even with her own capabilities, as the wound was too severe. Kind of like how administering bandages for an internal injury. It was hopeless. Ichigo stiffened at Nell's statement, at the emptiness of her tone. This was his fault to begin with. There had to be a way to help somehow. Ichigo creased his forehead as he pondered, the action displacing a few strands of his orange hair. Orange. Orange. Orium. It was as if thunder had resounded within Ichigo's mind. Recalling Orium's abilities, he realized that it was fully within her jurisdictions to heal the injured Aaron car. "We can save him," Ichigo said decisively, the confusion in his eyes regarding the war fading as he set a goal for himself. "One of my friends, Orium, a girl with orange hair like mine, has the means to heal injuries back to normal." Ichigo made to struggle out of Nell's grip, but for one reason or another, she wasn't letting go. In fact, her hold on him was getting stronger, her finger empowered by her spiritual energy. Ichigo glanced up at Nell in bewilderment. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I'm certain that if I can talk to Orium, she'll help out." Nell shook her head wearily. "It's not that easy," she said. "Look, even that girl over there understands it." Nell gestured towards Karen, causing Ichigo to glance back at his younger sister in time to see her biting on her lips. She was hesitating, her eyes darting back and forth as she refused to meet Ichigo's hopeful gaze. A pit steadily began forming at Ichigo's stomach. He wanted to call out to Karen to demand for an answer, but Nell forcibly shifted his attention back on her. "Listen, Ichigo, how can you possibly think that any of us Aaron car can just freely enter the Shinigami's ranks as we see fit?" Nell released a breath. "It's not possible. The only way is if we fight our way in." Her words said, Nell's expression frosted over as she turned her attention directly on Karen, her aura as a former Vasto Lord on full display. "Will you try to stop us?" She spoke sharply, threateningly. Placed under pressure, Karen was unable to answer. If she didn't have friends and acquaintances amongst the Shinigami, then maybe she could have just stepped aside, but she knew that she couldn't. Karen's silence was her answer. Light flickered within Nell's eyes, but it was at this point that Ichigo understood the implications of Nell's words. "Wait, hold on." He immediately attempted to struggle out of Nell's grip, but her arms were like vices. "I'm sorry," Nell apologized as she began channeling her spiritual energy, pink light surrounding her. Caught up in the midst of Nell's hold, Nell quickly struck both Ichigo and Silent at the back of their heads, forcibly knocking them unconscious. Falling limp in her embrace, Nell nodded towards the nearest Aaron car before passing them over. Nell regarded Ichigo and Silent as people close to her, and because of that, she would protect them from pain and hardship. Ichigo and Silent. They didn't have to fight if it would only bring them grief. Therefore, Nell would shoulder it all. At the instant, Nell rendered Ichigo and Silent unconscious. Karen's breath hitched. Why you dash? Nell cut Karen off by raising her hand. Ichigo regarded Karen as family. Nell wouldn't needlessly harm her more than necessary. Go, Nell said. These two will be safe, so focus on the fights that matter. Karen hesitated, her complexion paling. She didn't completely believe Nell's words, but from what she had seen of Nell's character, Nell could at least be somewhat trusted. Moreover, the Hollows didn't seem as evil as the Shinigami made them out to be. The fury that she had felt from the Aaron car over one of their own getting injured was genuine too. Karen's observations led her to a single conclusion. Did they really have to be enemies? As much as Karen wanted to pursue the matter, she knew that she was no longer welcome. If she stayed surrounded by the Aaron car any longer, then even Nell's commands wouldn't be able to save her. Still, she put one last sentence in. You know we're going to be enemies, right? Karen furrowed her brows. Nell simply nodded in acknowledgement. Glancing at Ichigo and Silent to make sure that they were safe, Karen began channeling her spiritual energy before traveling back to where she had come from. Watching Karen leave, Nell closed her eyes and began to think. She had two objectives. Destroy the Eastern Tower, and locate the woman known as Orium for the sake of a single Aaron car. It was incredulous now that Nell thought about it. The notion of going to such length to save the life of a single individual in a war with thousands of casualties. Then again, it was something that their Lord of Hollows would have done. 1 minute passed, then 2. Nell opened her eyes, her reservations and indecisions left buried within her. Sorry, Ichigo. All that remained was her duty. She was Neliel to Adolschwank, and the situation was war. Hueco Mundo vs the Sierra Di. Charge. She gave out the order without hesitation. Ichigo felt like he was in a dream, one that was more like a nightmare. Across from him stood a mirror image of himself, pale white and mouth curved into an unassuming sneer. How long are you going to sleep, King? His pale reflection continued to open and close its mouth, but it didn't matter because Ichigo couldn't hear anything. We had a deal, King. You put your faith in me, and together we can unleash our full potential. Our primal instincts. There was a nagging sense of urgency in his mind that prevented him from thinking about anything else. He vigorously attempted to move his body, but it felt like he was traversing through a thick pool of sludge, neither able to swim nor find a suitable purchase. His aimless wandering caused the reflection of himself he could see off the edge of his vision to frown further. We are of one soul and body. I the weapon, and you the vessel. We share our emotions and our views. If you sleep any longer, then the situation outside will become irreversible. Ichigo gasped. All of a sudden, the world around him began to shift, revealing a landscape of horizontal skyscrapers. The sun above was blocked by dark clouds, light rain beginning to pour over the world. The scene was dreary, sad, depressing. In the midst of it all, stood a man dressed fully in black, soaked to the bones. The old man doesn't like the rain. Hurry, King. Ichigo couldn't take his eyes off of the man, a power stirring from within him. A connection he had with his soul. Hollow and Shinigami, the two powers seemingly coming into a natural blend, creating a blur. Come on, King, I'm not the one who's supposed to be the voice of reason. His reflection continued to persist until finally there was a reaction. The man in black had had enough. I do not like the rain, the man spoke somberly, turning to address him. It hides the sun, the light of this world behind the gloom of a bitter cold. It was as if a hand had suddenly grasped fully around Ichigo's body. Thereafter, waves of blue spiritual energy erased any exhaustion and disorientation from Ichigo's mind, lifting him to a state of alertness. Around dim time. Ichigo heard the voice of his reflection, but he could hardly answer back. The man in black was being forceful, pushing Ichigo's conscious back into a state of awareness with only a single message. Stop the rain. To that end, I will lend you my power. The white reflection of Ichigo nodded its head to the old man's words. We are with you. The sword and instinct of your soul. Zanjutsu. By the time Ichigo realized what was going on, his body in the dimension of the fake Karakura town abruptly sat up, startlingly the Aaron car watching over him. That's not possible, Lady Nell knocked you out, the Arrancar muttered before trying to restrain Ichigo. Unfortunately, there was a vast difference in strength that only a person of Nell's capabilities would be able to restrain. Lips twitching, Ichigo drop-kicked the Arrancar over the head and put her out of commission. Head throbbing, Ichigo only had a moment to register the fact that Silent was unconscious beside him, Nell and the other Arrancar nowhere to be seen. What was going on? Ichigo placed a hand to his head as he recalled his most recent memories before his eyes widened. Fuck. His head snapped in the direction of the East Tower, his complexion draining from his face as he saw the carnage ensuing. Nell was like a war goddess. With her strength alone, she was combating against another captain-class Shinigami, Seijin Komamura, while being flanked by Karen, Chad, and Ishida. Rather than lose the advantage, Nell had already released her centaur form and was ruthlessly piercing through her opposition. On the tip of her lance, up to 3 bodies were run through like shish kebabs, the unseated class Shinigami unable to stop her for even a second. The other Arrancar Nell led were in fierce battle against the remaining Shinigami, many in their original forms in Hueco Mundo. One of the more prominent Arrancar fought an entire unit of elite Shinigami by himself. One of Baragon's followers, known as Neutra Gilga. The half-crescent blades he wielded on 4 of his arms decimated all in his path in showers of blood and gore. Scene after scene of violence fell into Ichigo's sight, and he lost it completely when he noticed all the injuries. Surrounded as Nell was, there was no way that she could have avoided sustaining any injuries. There was a glaring hole in one of her shoulders, and blood from open lacerations covered her entire body. Karen and the rest were fairly better, with only minor bleeding and bruises, but Ichigo wasn't a fool. He knew Nell, the type of character she possessed. Nell knew that Karen was his family, she would hold back subconsciously on his behalf. The result? More and more injuries. And Nell you dash. Ichigo clenched his fists and shot forward, the raging of his emotions causing gale-like fluctuation in the air as his spiritual energy grew out of control. Enough. Ichigo yelled, his throat hoarse. I said that's enough. Ichigo's sudden appearance caused the expression on Nell's face to flicker, more so with Karen, Chad, and Ishida, who began to hesitate. However, they didn't listen. No one believed that the current conflict could be so easily settled anymore. Nell herself had become the object of hatred for many Shinigami due to the amount of people she had killed to keep the Arrancar under her safe. To suddenly stop on Ichigo's words alone? Utterly impossible. Pressing the attack, Seijin engaged Nell and began forcing her into a corner with the aid of the other Shinigami, calling for Karen and the others to support him. Nell coughed out blood from a hard blow to her stomach. Left forgotten, Ichigo felt helpless, all his abilities seemingly amounting to nothing. What was it that he had thought that he could even do? What was it that he had even wanted to do? He had never wished to fight in a war to begin with. What he wanted was to keep his precious people safe under all circumstances. He stared at Nell, at all the Arrancar behind her, and then to Karen and his friends. He suddenly understood amidst the violence, betrayals, and hardships. Friend or foe, he didn't give a fucking shit. He would protect who he damn well wanted to protect. Spiritual energy began to subconsciously shroud around Ichigo like a thin veil that steadily grew more and more opaque. He needed power. A power so overwhelming that it couldn't possibly be ignored. Resonate with the spirit. Harmonize with the soul. 2 distinct energies began to well up from within his inner world. Hollow and Shinigami, a perfect blend between the two that none other than Ichigo could ever possess. He exhaled, the spiritual energy around him growing rampant in a vortex of blue tinged with red. He swung out his arm, Zanjutsu, the butcher knife-like sword, instantly drawn into his hand. An initial release, a Shikai. It wasn't enough. He needed more, to surpass the previous threshold and burst apart the floodgates. The aura around him began to skyrocket, the nearest Shinigami and Arrancar unable to tear their gazes away, a wailing echoing through the air. That right, King, that's how it's done. Call it. Call it. Unleash the Limiters. Zanjutsu began to glow in a dim light, the thickness of the sword shrinking to become sleeker. Ichigo was engulfed by his energy, reality distorting from the sheer pressure of his presence, a word hanging off of the edge of his lips released in a single breath. Bankai. Nell stopped, Karen stopped, everyone stopped. It was a power that none could ignore. A figure emerged from the depths, thick swaths of spiritual energy billowing in the wind. Skin the color of ivory. Tribal marks the color of crimson. And a savage visage like none other, the presence of a mask, undistinguishable. A monster. A beast. A devil. What could be seen in their eyes? The air trembled in agitation, as if fearful of the being within it. Of the demon glaring from the abyss of a seemingly limitless power. An overbearing howl echoing amidst the battlefield. The rising of a new power. Check the description for the links to the author.